There is a place in the middle of North America where the earth itself was once moved by human hands on a scale that has no easy explanation. Not a hill shaped by erosion, not a ridge carved by glacial ice. A deliberate construction, a monument so enormous in its conception, so precise in its alignment with the stars overhead, so carefully engineered in its layers of colored clay and river sand, and carefully compacted soil, that the engineers who have studied it in recent decades have come away with the same quiet, unsettled look on their faces. The look of people who have just encountered something that does not fit the story they were told. You have probably never heard of most of what this video is going to tell you. That is not an accident. It is a consequence of the way history gets written, and more importantly, the way it gets forgotten. We have a habit, as a civilization, of assuming that the things we know about the past are the most important things, that the stories preserved in our textbooks represent the fullest and most honest accounting of what human beings have done on this continent. But the ground tells a different story, and the ground has been speaking, quietly and persistently, for a very long time. Tonight we are going to listen to it. We are going to walk through a lost world that existed on this continent long before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. A world of cities that rivaled medieval London in population. A world of roads that stretched for hundreds of miles through mountain passes and desert canyons. A world of astronomical observatories built from wood and earth that tracked the movements of the sun and moon with a precision that modern archaeoastronomers find genuinely astonishing. A world of copper trade networks that moved raw material from the shores of Lake Superior to the Gulf of Mexico. A world of pyramid builders, canal engineers, and urban planners whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot read, and whose disappearance we still cannot fully explain. These are America's lost megastructures, and the civilization, or perhaps the civilizations, that built them remain one of the deepest and most fascinating mysteries in all of human history. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. The past has a way of settling the mind, of pulling you away from the noise of the present and into something older and quieter and more profound. So get comfortable, let the images come slowly, and maybe subscribe, and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather at a beginning, because the story of pre-Columbian North America does not have a single starting point. It has dozens of them, scattered across a continent of almost incomprehensible size and variety, emerging and developing and sometimes collapsing over a span of thousands of years. But there is one place that most researchers, most archaeologists, most historians of this particular subject eventually return to. One site that functions almost like a gravitational center for the entire question of what was happening in North America before Europeans arrived. One set of earthworks so vast, so sophisticated, so puzzling in their implications, that they have been quietly rewriting the history of this continent for the better part of 2 centuries. That place sits across the river from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, and for most of recorded American history, people drove past it on the interstate without knowing what it was. Its name is Cahokia. And before we are done tonight, you are going to understand why some archaeologists refer to it as the most important site in North American archaeology, and why others, more dramatically, call it proof of a civilization we were never taught existed. The mound rises 100 feet into the Illinois sky. 100 feet. That is 10 stories. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch, if you remove the pedestal. And it was built entirely by hand, by human beings carrying baskets of earth, over a period of perhaps 200 years, beginning sometime around the year 900 of the Common Era. The base of this structure covers 14 acres. 14 acres. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest stone pyramid ever constructed in human history, covers about 13 acres at its base. Monk's Mound, as it is called today, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the entire Western Hemisphere, and it sits in a suburb of St. Louis, and most Americans have never heard of it. But Monk's Mound was not built in isolation. It was the centerpiece of a city that at its peak, sometime around the year 1100 of the Common Era, may have housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people within its core urban area, with perhaps another 10,000 living in the surrounding settlements and agricultural villages that fed it. At that moment in history, London, England, had a population of roughly 15,000 people. Cahokia was, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest cities in the world. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. At the same time that William the Conqueror was reshaping medieval England, at the same time that the First Crusade was being organized in Europe, at the same time that the Song dynasty was flourishing in China, and the Islamic Golden Age was producing some of the greatest scholars and mathematicians the world had ever seen, there was a city in what is now the American Midwest that was home to tens of thousands of people. A city with a central plaza larger than 40 football fields. A city with residential neighborhoods and a market district, and what appears to have been a carefully planned civic and ceremonial core. A city surrounded by a wooden stockade wall nearly 2 miles long, reinforced with bastions placed at regular intervals, that was rebuilt at least 3 times during the city's history. This is not speculation, this is archaeology. The remains of Cahokia are still there, beneath and around the suburban landscape that grew up over them in the 20th century. Archaeologists have been excavating them systematically for decades, and what they have found continues to challenge every comfortable assumption we make about what happened in North America before Columbus. Let us talk about the engineering first, because it is where the mystery gets most acute. Monk's Mound was not simply piled up, it was engineered. Core samples taken through its interior reveal a complex layered structure of different soil types, carefully selected and placed in a specific sequence to provide stability and drainage. The builders used clay-rich soils from one location for waterproofing certain layers. They used sandy soils from another location to provide drainage. They understood, at some intuitive and practical level, the principles of soil mechanics that modern civil engineers study formally in university programs. They built a structure that has survived more than 1,000 years of freeze-thaw cycles and heavy Midwestern rainfall without catastrophic structural failure, which is more than can be said for some modern earthen dams. The mound was built in stages, with each major construction phase representing an enormous mobilization of human labor. Researchers have estimated that the total volume of earth moved to construct Monk's Mound alone represents something in the range of 22 million cubic feet of soil. That is soil that had to be dug from somewhere nearby, carried in baskets to the construction site, and carefully placed and compacted by human hands with no machinery of any kind, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals for this purpose, no iron tools, just people and baskets, and an organizational system sophisticated enough to direct the labor of thousands of workers over a period of generations. Where did they dig the earth? Archaeologists have identified the borrow pits, the areas from which the construction soil was extracted. Some of them are now lakes, filled with groundwater. They form a kind of shadow geography around the site, the negative spaces that correspond to the positive mass of the mounds, like a photographic negative of the city's ambitions. And Monk's Mound was not the only mound, not even close. At the height of Cahokia's power, the city and its immediate surroundings contained more than 120 earthen mounds of various sizes and shapes. Flat-topped platform mounds that supported the buildings where the elite lived and the ceremonies were conducted. Conical burial mounds that contained the remains of individuals interred with elaborate grave goods. Ridge-top mounds whose precise function remains debated. And the central plaza itself, which was not a natural flat area but had been artificially leveled, the high spots scraped down and the low spots filled in, to create a perfectly flat ceremonial space covering roughly 50 acres. The planning that went into the layout of this city is one of the things that researchers find most difficult to explain within the conventional narrative of North American prehistory. The central precinct of Cahokia was not arranged haphazardly. It was organized according to a coherent plan, with the major mounds positioned in deliberate relationship to one another and to the cardinal directions. The main axis of the city runs very close to true north-south. The positioning of certain mounds appears to encode astronomical alignments, and the whole complex was apparently planned and laid out before construction began on a large scale, suggesting a level of civic organization and long-range planning that we rarely associate with pre-Columbian North American societies. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery at Cahokia, the one that most dramatically shifted how researchers thought about this civilization, happened not on a mound but in a series of post holes. Archaeologists excavating near Monk's Mound discovered a series of large circular arrangements of wooden posts. The posts themselves were long gone, having rotted away more than a millennium ago. But the holes in the ground where they had once stood were still there, filled with a slightly different soil than the surrounding earth, invisible to the eye but detectable through careful excavation. The arrangements were enormous, the largest more than 400 feet in diameter, and when researchers analyzed the sightlines from their centers toward the positions of the posts on the circumference, they found something that stopped them cold. The posts marked the rising points of the sun on the solstices and the equinoxes. The circular post arrangements were solar calendars, precise, deliberate, sophisticated solar calendars built from wood on the flat ground of the American Midwest, aligned to the movements of the sun across the horizon with an accuracy that required careful and sustained astronomical observation over many years. The researchers who discovered this, working in the 1960s, called the site Woodhenge. The name is an obvious reference to Stonehenge in England, and the comparison is apt in some ways, though misleading in others. Cahokia's Woodhenge was not built from stone. It would have been entirely invisible from the air, entirely invisible from any distance, a forest of tall wooden posts rising from the flat plain of the central plaza. But its function appears to have been similar. It was an instrument for tracking time, for marking the turning points of the year, for organizing the ceremonial and agricultural life of a complex society around the rhythms of the cosmos. And there was not just one of them. There were at least 5 successive woodhenges at Cahokia, each one slightly different in size and orientation from the last, each one apparently replacing or supplementing its predecessor. The community of Cahokia rebuilt its astronomical observatory multiple times over the course of the city's history. Each rebuild was not simply a reconstruction of what had existed before, but a refinement, a recalibration, a return to the problem of tracking the sky with renewed precision. What does that tell us? It tells us that astronomical observation was not a casual or peripheral activity at Cahokia. It was central. It was important enough to justify the enormous labor of repeatedly digging, transporting, and erecting dozens of massive wooden posts in a precisely calculated arrangement. It was important enough that when the posts rotted and the arrangement became inaccurate, the community rebuilt it rather than abandoning it. Whatever ceremonies and agricultural calendars and civic rituals depended on this instrument, they mattered enough to invest in it generation after generation. This is not the behavior of a society we should be comfortable describing as primitive. And the story of Cahokia gets stranger still when we look at what its archaeologists found in the burial mounds. Specifically, when we look at what they found in a place that has come to be known as Mound 72. Mound 72 is a small mound by Cahokia standards. It is low and elongated, easily overlooked among the more dramatic conical and platform mounds that surround it, but it is aligned precisely along the northwest-southeast axis that corresponds to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. And when archaeologists excavated it in the 1960s and 1970s, what they found inside changed the conversation about Cahokia forever. In the center of the mound, they found the burial of a man. He was laid on a platform of more than 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, a falcon specifically, its wings outspread beneath him. He wore elaborate ornaments. He was surrounded by grave goods of extraordinary richness, including caches of arrow points numbering in the hundreds, made from exotic flint quarried far from Cahokia. Near him were buried other individuals, women and men, some of whom appear to have been sacrificed to accompany him in death. And scattered through the mound were additional mass burials, groups of young women interred together in numbers that suggest ritual sacrifice on a scale that the archaeological community was not entirely prepared for. The falcon imagery is significant. The falcon, or more specifically a kind of divine birdman figure that combines human and raptor characteristics, is one of the most pervasive symbols in a broad network of iconographic motifs that researchers now call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, or sometimes simply the Southern Cult. This symbolic system, featuring a consistent set of images including the birdman, the chunky player, the long-nosed god, the hand and eye motif, and others, appears across an enormous geographic range, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. It appears on copper plates, on shell gorgets, on ceramic vessels, on stone pipes, and in various other media. And its distribution tells us something extraordinary about the world that Cahokia existed within. Cahokia was not isolated. It was the center of a network of trade, of ceremony, of ideology, of influence that connected societies across much of eastern North America. The copper in Cahokia's burial mounds came from the Lake Superior region, more than 500 miles to the north. The marine shells came from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles to the south. The exotic flint in the arrow caches came from sources scattered across the Midwest and South. And the shared symbolic vocabulary of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex suggests that the ideas, the religious concepts, the ceremonial practices that unified this network were spreading even faster and farther than the physical trade goods. This is not how we were taught to think about pre-Columbian North America. We were taught to think of it as a collection of isolated, small-scale societies, hunter-gatherer bands and simple farming villages, each one largely self-contained, trading a little bit with its immediate neighbors but largely unaware of the broader world. The picture that archaeology is actually revealing is something quite different, something much more interesting, and in some ways much more troubling, because it raises questions we do not yet know how to answer. How did a city like Cahokia arise? Where did the knowledge come from? Who organized it? Who planned it? Who convinced or compelled tens of thousands of people to participate in the construction of monuments on this scale? And what happened to it? Because Cahokia did not survive, the city that was, for a moment in the 11th and 12th centuries, one of the great urban centers of the world, was largely abandoned by the year 1400. The wooden buildings rotted away, the stockade walls fell, the plazas were reclaimed by grass and forest. And when the first European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found the mounds still standing, still visible, still enormous, but the city that had built them was gone, and the people living nearby had, in most cases, no tradition that clearly connected them to it. The disappearance of Cahokia is as mysterious, in its own way, as its rise, and it is part of a broader pattern that we are going to explore tonight. Because Cahokia was not the only great pre-Columbian civilization in North America to rise, flower, and then vanish. It was not even the first, and it was not the most puzzling. For that, we need to travel further back in time, and further east, we need to go to Ohio. The state of Ohio contains one of the most extraordinary concentrations of prehistoric earthworks anywhere in the world. Not just in North America, anywhere in the world. If you were to travel across the state and visit all the major earthwork sites that survive today, even in their degraded, partially destroyed, overgrown condition, you would come away with a sense that something remarkable happened here. Something that our standard narratives of pre-Columbian life cannot quite account for. Something that has been puzzling and sometimes deeply unsettling the researchers who study it for more than 2 centuries. The people who built these earthworks are known to archaeologists as the Hopewell culture, though that name is a modern invention that would have meant nothing to the people themselves. The term comes from a farm in southern Ohio where some of the most dramatic earthworks were first seriously studied in the 19th century. The Hopewell people were not a single tribe or a single political entity. They were a network, a cultural phenomenon, a shared set of practices and beliefs, and artistic traditions that connected communities across a vast swath of eastern North America, from Kansas to New York, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. They flourished primarily between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE, a period of about 6 centuries, during which they built some of the most geometrically precise and astronomically sophisticated earthen monuments in the ancient world. And then, around 500 CE, they stopped. The great earthwork building tradition faded. The elaborate mortuary ceremonies that had driven so much of the construction came to an end. The long-distance trade networks that had moved exotic materials across the continent began to collapse. And the Hopewell culture, as archaeologists define it, ceased to exist. We do not know why. But before we get to the ending, let us dwell for a while in the extraordinary middle of this story. Let us try to understand what the Hopewell people were actually doing and why it is so hard to fit their achievements into the frameworks we normally use for thinking about pre-Columbian North American societies. The earthworks at Newark, Ohio, are probably the best place to start, because they represent the largest complex of geometric earthworks ever constructed anywhere in the ancient world. Let that sentence sit for a moment. Not just in North America, in the world. The Newark earthworks, as they survive today and as they have been reconstructed through historical surveys and modern remote sensing, enclosed an area of more than 4 square miles. 4 square miles of precisely constructed geometric earthforms, including a perfect circle, an octagon, a square, an oval, and various connecting walls and enclosures, all laid out with a precision that should not have been possible for a society without the tools or mathematical knowledge we associate with sophisticated civilization. The Great Circle at Newark is exactly that, a circular earthwork enclosing about 20 acres, with walls that vary from 8 to 14 feet in height, and a circumference of more than a mile. The walls are not rough or irregular. They describe a circle that, when surveyed with modern instruments, proves to be geometrically precise to a degree that astonishes researchers. The interior of the circle is slightly lower than the surrounding ground, suggesting that the earth for the walls was scraped from inside the enclosure. There is a single gateway opening in the wall, and the sightline from the center of the circle through this gateway aligns precisely with the rising point of the moon at its southernmost extreme, a cycle that recurs only once every 18.6 years. That last detail matters enormously. The southern extreme of the moon's rise, what astronomers call the lunar standstill, is not something you can observe in a single year. It is not something you can observe in a decade. You have to watch the moon's rising point across the horizon for nearly 19 years to see it reach its southern extreme. And then you have to connect the dot of that observation to the gateway of your earthwork. This required a tradition of sustained astronomical observations spanning generations. It required people who were willing to watch the sky night after night, year after year, and record what they saw in a form that could be transmitted to their successors, who would continue the observation, who would eventually construct an earthwork that encoded the culmination of that multi-generational project. This is not casual behavior. This is not a simple agricultural society building crude earthen walls for defensive purposes. This is something that requires not just labor and organizational capacity, but intellectual sophistication of a high order. The ability to think in cycles of nearly 20 years. The ability to conceptualize and record astronomical data. The ability to translate that data into a precise geometric structure in the landscape. And the institutional continuity to sustain all of this across time. And the Great Circle is only one element of the Newark complex. Connected to it, by walls that enclosed parallel corridors leading across the landscape, was the octagon, a geometric earthwork that researchers have been struggling to fully comprehend for generations. The octagon at Newark encloses 50 acres of flat ground within its 8-sided walls, each side roughly 1,000 feet long. 8 small circular mounds are placed at each of its corners, and from the center of the octagon, the sight lines toward the gateways in its walls align with all 8 of the significant rising and setting points of the moon across its full 6-year cycle. not just one lunar alignment. All 8 of the major lunar alignments, the northern and southern extremes of both the rising and the setting moon, as well as the midpoints of the cycle, encoded simultaneously in the geometry of a single earthwork. Let me be precise about what this means. To build the octagon at Newark, someone, or more likely a series of someones working across multiple generations, had to observe the moon's full 18 six-year cycle through at least one complete iteration and probably several. They had to identify all 8 of the significant positions in that cycle: the extreme northern rise, the extreme northern set, the extreme southern rise, the extreme southern set, and the 4 midpoint positions. They had to devise a geometric form that would simultaneously encode all 8 of these positions through its gateway alignments. They had to translate that geometric form into a precise plan that could be executed on the ground at a scale of 50 acres. And they had to mobilize the labor necessary to actually build it, which means the earth for those walls, some of them reaching 12 feet in height, had to be dug and carried and placed over an enormous area. Archaeoastronomers who have studied the Newark octagon in recent decades describe it as one of the most sophisticated astronomical monuments in the ancient world. Not the ancient Western world, the ancient world, period. It encodes a more complete record of the lunar cycle than Stonehenge. It is more precisely aligned than most of the megalithic monuments of Bronze Age Europe, and it was built by a people who left no written records, no metal tools, no evidence of a state-level political organization, and whose way of life, as best we can reconstruct it, was centered on hunting, fishing, gathering, and small-scale horticulture. That gap between the apparent simplicity of the Hopewell way of life and the extraordinary complexity and precision of their earthworks is the heart of the mystery. It is what keeps researchers coming back to these sites, decade after decade, with new questions and new methods, and sometimes, genuinely, new answers that raise even more questions. The answer that most archaeologists have converged on, or at least the best framework that current evidence supports, is that the Hopewell earthworks were not the product of a permanent urban population living at the site. They were not the infrastructure of a city. They were ceremonial centers, places where communities from a wide surrounding region gathered periodically for ceremonies, trade, feasting, and the interment of their dead, and then dispersed back to their scattered village communities across the landscape. This model has important implications. It means that the Hopewell people solved the organizational problem of building monuments of extraordinary scale and precision without the aid of permanent urban populations or coercive state power. They did it through a shared ceremonial tradition that was powerful enough, meaningful enough, important enough that scattered communities across hundreds of miles voluntarily contributed their labor to these periodic construction projects. The monuments were the product not of a pharaoh's command, but of what we might call sacred obligation, a shared understanding that participating in the construction and maintenance of these ceremonial places was one of the most important things a community could do. That is a profound insight into a very different way of organizing human society, and it raises the question of what, exactly, was so important about these places that communities were willing to invest so much in building them. Part of the answer lies in what the Hopewell people put into the ground at these sites. Because the burial practices of the Hopewell culture are among the most extraordinary in the ancient world, and the goods found in Hopewell burial mounds represent a window into a world of symbolic sophistication and material culture that has no easy parallel. Hopewell burials contain objects made from materials that were gathered from across the continent. Copper from the Lake Superior region, hammered into thin sheets and cut into elaborate shapes, beaten into breastplates and headdress ornaments, and geometric cutouts that would have shimmered in firelight. Mica from the mountains of North Carolina, cut into delicate shapes including human hands and claws and serpentine forms that seem to hover at the edge of abstraction. Obsidian from Yellowstone, hundreds of miles to the west, flaked into large bifaces that were clearly never intended for practical use, but were objects of ceremonial significance, whose value lay partly in the vast distance they had traveled. shark teeth and conch shells and alligator skulls from the Gulf Coast, bear teeth and wolf teeth from the forests of the Midwest and East, silver from the shores of the Great Lakes. The Hopewell trade network that moved all of these materials was one of the most extensive in the pre-Columbian world. Obsidian from Yellowstone has been found in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio. Copper from Lake Superior has been found in Hopewell contexts in Arkansas. Marine shells from the Gulf have been found in Hopewell sites in Michigan. The distances involved are staggering when you consider that these were all moved by human carriers, by dugout canoes, by people walking overland trails, with no wheeled vehicles, no pack animals, no infrastructure of any kind that we would recognize as a transportation network. And yet the network functioned. It moved materials across thousands of miles. It moved ideas across similar distances, because the artistic traditions of the Hopewell culture are remarkably consistent across this enormous geographic range, suggesting that craftspeople in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Kansas were working within a shared symbolic vocabulary, a shared aesthetic tradition, a shared understanding of what certain images meant and how they should be rendered. Among the most haunting of the objects found in Hopewell burial mounds are the effigy pipes. These are platform pipes, small sculptural objects carved from stone with a flat base that contained a tobacco bowl at one end and a mouthpiece at the other, with the entire surface of the base carved into an animal figure. A beaver, a raven, a raptor, a bear, a river otter with a fish in its mouth, a frog, a wildcat crouching as if to spring. These figures are rendered with a naturalistic precision and an emotional immediacy that has led some art historians to describe Hopewell effigy pipes as among the finest animal sculptures of the ancient world. That claim is not hyperbole. These are objects of genuine artistic mastery. They were carved, apparently, by specialists, people who had dedicated their lives to the craft and who achieved a level of skill that places their work in the company of the great sculptural traditions of the ancient world. And they were made specifically to be placed in the earth, to be buried with the dead. They were not objects for daily use. They were sacred objects, made at great cost, used once in a ceremony, and then interred forever in the darkness of a burial mound, where they would not be seen again for 2,000 years. What does it mean to create an object of that quality and then immediately bury it? It means that quality mattered, not for its practical utility, but for its symbolic power. It means that the relationship between the object and the spirit world, whatever the Hopewell people believed about the spirit world, was more important than the object's visibility or usability in the living world. It means a society that had developed very sophisticated ideas about value, about sacrifice, about the relationship between the material and the immaterial. This is a society that we have no adequate language for, working within our conventional frameworks. They were not a civilization in the sense that we usually use the word. They had no cities, no writing, no metal tools, no wheels. But they had things that we sometimes forget to count. They had astronomical knowledge of a very high order. They had artistic traditions of genuine sophistication. They had trade networks of continental scale. They had ceremonial traditions that could mobilize enormous quantities of human labor in the service of constructing monuments aligned to precise astronomical observations. And they had all of this for 6 centuries, and then they stopped. Why did Hopewell end? This is a question that has occupied researchers for a long time, and honest scholars admit that we do not have a satisfying answer. The end of the Hopewell culture, around 500 CE, was not abrupt and dramatic in the way that, say, the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean was abrupt and dramatic. It was more of a gradual fading, a slow dissolution of the network and the traditions that had held it together. The long-distance trade in exotic materials declined. The elaborate burial ceremonies that had driven so much of the earthwork construction became simpler. The great geometric enclosures ceased to be built or maintained, and the remarkable artistic tradition that had produced the effigy pipes, and the copper cutouts, and the mica ornaments faded away. Some researchers point to climate change. The period around 500 CE saw significant climate variability in eastern North America, which may have disrupted the agricultural systems on which the Hopewell communities depended. Others point to social dynamics, suggesting that the Hopewell ceremonial complex had always been inherently unstable, dependent on a fragile balance between competing regional communities, and that this balance eventually broke down. Others note that the disappearance of the Hopewell trade network coincides with significant changes in the distribution of game animals and wild plant resources across eastern North America, suggesting ecological disruption that may have forced communities to redirect their energy from long-distance exchange to local subsistence. All of these explanations may be partially correct. The collapse of a complex network is rarely simple. It rarely has a single cause. It is usually the result of multiple stresses accumulating over time until a system that had seemed robust suddenly proves to be fragile. But what is most striking about the end of the Hopewell culture is not the collapse itself, but what came after. Because the great mounds did not disappear when Hopewell ended. They remained in the landscape, visible and permanent, and the communities that lived among them in the centuries that followed continued to interact with them. Sometimes they dug into older mounds to use them as locations for new burials. Sometimes they apparently avoided the great geometric enclosures, perhaps treating them with the kind of sacred reverence that one extends to a place whose original significance has been lost, but whose power remains felt. And sometimes they built new earthworks, smaller and less geometrically precise than their predecessors, in what may have been an attempt to continue a tradition they no longer fully understood. And then, several centuries after Hopewell ended, something happened in the American Midwest that the landscape had never seen before. A new kind of settlement appeared, a new kind of monument, a new kind of society, and at the center of it all, a new kind of human ambition that would, for a few remarkable centuries, transform the Mississippi Valley into something that the word city is not quite adequate to describe. We have already met Cahokia, but to understand Cahokia fully, you have to understand the tradition from which it emerged. And that tradition, stretching back through the Hopewell culture and beyond, into the deep roots of North American history, is what we have been tracing tonight. But now let us leave Ohio and the Mississippi Valley for a moment. Let us go west. Let us go to a place where a different kind of civilization, equally mysterious in its own way, built structures that still puzzle and astonish the people who study them. Let us go to the desert southwest. And let us talk about a place called Chaco, in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, in a canyon that collects the wind and throws it back at you no matter which direction you are walking. There stand the ruins of buildings so extraordinary in their ambition that the archaeologists who first studied them in the late 19th and early 20th centuries genuinely struggled to believe that the ancestors of the people living in the Southwest could have built them. This embarrassing fact that educated American researchers reflexively refuse to credit indigenous people with their own ancestors' achievements tells us something important about the history of North American archaeology. But the buildings themselves, those remarkable and mysterious structures rising from the canyon floor and the canyon rim, those tell us something even more important. They tell us that between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, something extraordinary happened in Chaco Canyon, something that went far beyond the construction of impressive buildings and created, for a few centuries, what many researchers now believe was the dominant political and ceremonial center of the entire American Southwest. Chaco Canyon is not an obvious place to build a civilization. It is dry. The average annual rainfall is less than 9 inches, which places it in the category of near desert. The growing season is short. The soil is thin and rocky. The nearest reliable source of timber is miles away, in the mountains on the horizon. And yet, beginning in the 9th century of the Common Era, the people we call the ancestral Puebloans, or sometimes by the older and less accurate name Anasazi, began constructing in this unpromising canyon a series of buildings of breathtaking scale and sophistication. These buildings are called Great Houses. The largest of them, Pueblo Bonito, contained more than 600 rooms arranged in a D-shaped arc that rose to 4 stories at its back wall and enclosed two large circular ceremonial chambers called kivas, plus dozens of smaller ones. When the last of its construction phases was completed, sometime around 1115 CE, Pueblo Bonito was the largest building in North America and would remain so for another 700 years. The first apartment building in the United States to exceed it in number of rooms was not built until 1887. But what makes Chaco's great houses genuinely extraordinary is not merely their size. It is the precision and sophistication with which they were built and aligned. The walls of Pueblo Bonito were constructed using a technique called core and veneer construction, in which a rubble-filled core was faced with carefully selected and precisely fitted facing stones, creating an exterior surface of remarkable uniformity and beauty. Chacoan masonry, as it is known, went through several distinct stylistic phases over the centuries, each one more refined and intricate than the last. The later phases of Chacoan stonework, with their carefully selected and fitted tabular stones creating patterns of banded color and texture in the walls, represent a masonry tradition that has been compared, seriously, to the finest stonework of ancient Rome and medieval Europe, and it was achieved with no metal tools, no mortar stronger than adobe clay, and no technology more mechanically sophisticated than handheld stone mauls and chisels. The astronomical alignments at Chaco are perhaps even more remarkable than the masonry. Pueblo Bonito's back wall, the straight southern wall of its D shape, runs precisely east-west. The great kiva in its east court is aligned north-south. The walls of the canyon itself, where they are straight, run close to cardinal directions, and researchers studying the relationships between the various buildings and landscape features of the Chaco system have found an extraordinary network of astronomical alignments embedded in the architecture. The most dramatic of these is a solar calendar discovered in 1977, high on the face of a butte above the canyon floor. Here, in a spot accessible only by a difficult climb, 3 stone slabs lean against the cliff face in a configuration that, on the summer solstice, causes a narrow sliver of sunlight to pass between them and fall precisely through the center of a spiral petroglyph carved into the cliff behind them. A dagger of light stabbing through the center of a carved spiral, exactly at noon on the longest day of the year. The effect is precise to within a few minutes, and repeats annually with the reliability of clockwork. This is not an accidental alignment. The stone slabs are not naturally positioned. They were moved and carefully arranged to create this specific effect, and the spiral petroglyph was carved precisely where the light falls, not somewhere nearby. The calendar was designed as a complete system, with the moving light and the carved stone symbol working together to mark the moment of the solstice with visual drama and precision. And the spiral also marks the equinoxes, with a somewhat different pattern of light and shadow, suggesting that the site was used as a comprehensive solar calendar, not just a single event marker. How long did it take to design and calibrate this calendar? You would need to observe the sun's movement along the cliff face across at least one full year, probably several, to identify the precise position where the light dagger would fall on the solstice. You would need to move the stone slabs, which are heavy, to exactly the right positions. You would need to test the effect at multiple seasons and adjust the positions if necessary. You would need to carve the spiral in precisely the right location. All of this required sustained attention, astronomical knowledge, and a purposefulness that seems barely consistent with the conventional image of simple desert farmers. The roads of Chaco are another chapter in the mystery that most people never encounter. Radiating outward from the canyon in multiple directions, sometimes visible from the air even today as parallel lines of slightly different soil color, the Chacoan roads are one of the most puzzling features of this already puzzling system. The roads are impressive in their own right. They are wide, sometimes 30 feet or more across. They are precisely straight, following a bearing with remarkable consistency even across difficult terrain. Where a hill stands in their path, they do not detour around it. They go straight up the hill and straight down the other side, using carved stairways cut into the rock face when necessary. They are sometimes bordered by low earthen berms or masonry curbs, At intervals along some roads, there are small structures, masonry platforms or shrines, that may have functioned as waymarkers or rest stops. The road system extended for hundreds of miles in several directions from Chaco, connecting the canyon to a network of outlying great houses and smaller community sites scattered across the San Juan Basin and beyond. At least 30 major roads have been identified, and the total length of the system, if all the roads that have been detected are included, likely exceeds 500 miles. Now, here is the thing that puzzles researchers most about the Chacoan roads. The ancestral Puebloans had no wheeled vehicles. They had no horses or other pack animals. Everything they moved on foot or on their backs. And the roads are designed for something that does not need a smooth, wide, precisely straight surface. Foot traffic does not require a 30-foot wide roadway. Foot traffic does not need to go straight up a hill when it could more easily go around it. Foot traffic does not need to be perfectly straight over distances of dozens of miles. So what were the roads for? The most common answer among researchers today involves ritual and pilgrimage. The roads may have functioned primarily as ceremonial pathways, routes along which large groups of people traveled to and from Chaco Canyon for periodic ceremonies and gatherings. The width and straightness of the roads may have been statements of power and intention rather than practical engineering solutions. Walking a perfectly straight road for dozens of miles is an act of deliberate orientation, a physical expression of a purposeful relationship between a community and a ceremonial center. The straightness is the point. This interpretation is supported by evidence suggesting that the great houses at the outlier communities connected by the roads were not primarily residential but ceremonial, places where communities gathered periodically, stored goods that would be redistributed during ceremonies, and participated in a shared ritual life organized around the great houses and ultimately around Chaco Canyon itself. But this interpretation raises a question that researchers still debate vigorously. If Chaco was a ceremonial center, what kind of authority did it exercise over the communities in its network? Was Chaco a political capital, a place where a centralized authority collected tribute and directed labor? Was it a religious center, a holy place whose authority was spiritual rather than political? Was it a trading hub, a place where the redistribution of goods organized the economic life of the region? Or was it all of these things simultaneously, in a complex that we cannot quite map onto any of our familiar categories? The evidence points in different directions depending on which aspect of the Chaco system you examine. The architecture of the great houses suggests centralized planning and a high degree of organizational authority. The distribution of exotic goods at Chaco, including turquoise from mines in New Mexico and Colorado, macaws from Mexico, cacao residue in ceramic vessels, and copper bells also from Mexico, suggests a node in a very long-distance trade network. The road system suggests the exercise of power over a vast hinterland, but the evidence for large permanent populations at Chaco itself is surprisingly thin, leading some researchers to argue that the canyon was sparsely populated most of the time and became densely populated only during periodic ceremonial gatherings. One thing that is clear from the evidence is that Chaco consumed enormous quantities of timber for its construction. The beams in the roofs of the great houses are massive wooden logs, hundreds of them in a single building, and the wood had to be brought to the canyon from forests in the mountains, some of them 50 miles or more away. More than 200,000 timbers were brought to Chaco Canyon during the period of major construction. They were brought by people carrying them on their shoulders, through terrain that offers very little in the way of easy passage, over distances that in some cases required days of travel. The scale of this timber procurement effort gives you some sense of the organizational capacity that Chaco commanded. This was not a task that could be accomplished by a small community acting alone. It required coordinated effort across a wide region. It required the ability to direct labor from many communities toward a single purpose. And it required a clear and shared understanding of why that purpose was worth the enormous investment. And then, like Cahokia, like Hopewell, like all the great pre-Columbian complexes we are visiting tonight, Chaco ended. The construction of new great houses ceased after about 1150 CE. By around 1150 to 1200, the canyon appears to have been largely abandoned by its permanent residents. The roads fell out of use. The outlier communities in the network gradually disconnected from the Chacoan system and began to develop in different directions. And what had been, for 3 centuries, the organizing center of life across hundreds of thousands of square miles of the American Southwest became a landscape of beautiful ruins, slowly reclaimed by the desert wind. Why? Again, we have theories. A severe drought lasting nearly 50 years, beginning around 1130 CE, was almost certainly a major factor. The already marginal agricultural system of Chaco Canyon would have been devastated by such a prolonged dry period, and the redistribution network that had sustained the canyon's population by drawing in surplus food from outlying communities would have collapsed when those communities were themselves struggling to survive. There are also signs of social tension in the later periods at Chaco, including evidence of violence and possibly of a political situation that had become unstable. Perhaps the authority that Chaco had commanded was always more fragile than its monuments suggested, and the drought provided the final stress that broke a system already under strain. What is striking, and what we do not talk about enough, is the continuity that followed the end of Chaco. The ancestral Puebloan people did not disappear. They moved. They reorganized. They built new communities in new locations, along rivers and canyon systems that offered more reliable water. They developed new architectural traditions and new social structures. And their descendants are still here today, living in the pueblos of New Mexico and Arizona, maintaining cultural and spiritual traditions that reach back, in some cases, to the world of Chaco and before. The story of Chaco is not a story of extinction, it is a story of transformation. A complex and powerful system adapted to one set of conditions collapsed when those conditions changed radically, and the people who had built that system found new ways to organize their lives and their communities in response to the changed world they found themselves in. But that story of transformation takes nothing away from the extraordinary achievement that Chaco represented during its centuries of florescence. And it takes nothing away from the mystery that surrounds it, because even with all the decades of archaeological research, even with all the sophisticated methods now available to study ancient sites, we still cannot answer the most fundamental questions about Chaco with any confidence. We still do not know who held power there, and how that power was organized. We still do not know the precise nature of the ceremonies that animated the great kivas and plazas of the canyon. We still do not fully understand how the road system worked or who used it. And we still cannot account for all the details of the canyon's construction sequence and the decisions that shaped it. Chaco remains, in the most honest assessment, a mystery wrapped in extraordinary stone. And we have not finished exploring the mysteries of the Southwest, because Chaco was not the only remarkable achievement of the ancestral Puebloan world. To the north, in the canyon country of Colorado and Utah, there is another set of structures that presents a different kind of mystery entirely. Not the mystery of astronomical sophistication and long-distance networks, the mystery of a place where people chose to live in ways that seem, from our current vantage point, almost inconceivably difficult. I am talking about the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. There is a place in southwestern Colorado where the walls of a canyon are layered in bands of color, ochre and rust and cream and gray, and where the afternoon light comes in at an angle that turns the cliff faces into something that looks almost painted, and tucked into the natural alcoves and overhangs of those cliff faces, built directly onto ledges of stone that sometimes measure only a few feet in depth, are the remains of entire villages. Multi-story stone buildings, towers, kivas, storage rooms, granaries, all constructed in spaces that seem to defy the possibility of comfortable habitation, all built by people who then lived there, raised children there, ground corn there, held ceremonies there, looked out from those impossible heights at the forested mesa top above and the canyon floor below, and somehow made it work. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were inhabited for roughly a century, from about 1200 CE to about 1300 CE. They were built by the descendants of the same ancestral Puebloan people who had once participated in the Chacoan network, people who had moved northward and developed their own regional traditions after the collapse of the Chacoan system. And they represent something new in the Puebloan world, a dramatic shift in settlement pattern that archaeologists have long found puzzling. Why did people move into the cliffs? For generations, the standard answer was defense. The cliff dwellings are defensible in obvious ways. They are hard to approach unseen. They are hard to attack. A community living in a natural alcove 150 feet up a cliff face does not need to worry much about surprise raids. So the story that most textbooks tell is that the ancestral Puebloans of the Mesa Verde region moved into the cliffs in the late 1200s because they were under attack from some external threat, perhaps from raiding parties, perhaps from newly arriving groups, and that the cliff dwellings represented a defensive response. There is something to this story. There is evidence of violence in some Mesa Verde period sites. There is evidence of burned villages and hurriedly abandoned communities. And the cliff dwellings are genuinely defensive in their configuration. But there is more to it than defense. Because the cliff dwellings are not just practical refuges, they are also, in many cases, extraordinarily carefully built. The masonry at Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde, includes some of the finest stonework of the Puebloan world, with carefully selected and fitted sandstone blocks creating walls of remarkable uniformity and beauty. The kivas at Cliff Palace are built with the same attention to detail and precision that characterizes the best architecture of the Chacoan period. And the spatial organization of the dwelling, the way rooms and ceremonial spaces and storage facilities are arranged in relation to one another, suggests careful planning rather than improvised construction. Cliff Palace contained about 150 rooms and 23 kivas. At its peak, it housed perhaps 125 people. It was not a city, it was a village, tightly packed into a sandstone alcove roughly 130 feet deep and 215 feet wide, with some portions of the dwelling rising 4 stories above the alcove floor. Living in Cliff Palace would have required a daily routine that most of us today would find physically demanding to the point of exhaustion. To reach the mesa top above, where the agricultural fields were, residents had to climb a series of hand and toe holds carved into the cliff face, slots in the sandstone just large enough to grip with fingers and toes, leading up a sheer vertical face dozens of feet high. Every journey to the fields meant this climb. Every trip to the water source at the bottom of the canyon meant a descent. Every basket of corn had to be carried up those notched cliff walls. Every piece of building stone, every beam of construction timber, every jar of water had to be brought in from outside through routes that required serious physical effort. And yet people chose this. They built carefully and beautifully in this difficult setting. They created ceremonial spaces with the same attention and intention that their ancestors had invested in the great kivas of Chaco. They painted the walls of their rooms with geometric designs and abstract motifs. They made pottery of considerable sophistication, decorated with black-on-white geometric designs that are among the finest ceramic achievements of the pre-Columbian Southwest. They buried their dead in the trash middens at the base of the cliff, accompanied by grave goods that reflect a continued engagement with a rich spiritual tradition. And then, around 1300 CE, they left. All of them. The entire Mesa Verde region, which had supported a population of perhaps 30,000 people at its peak, was abandoned completely within a generation or two. The cliff dwellings that people had invested such effort in building, that their parents and grandparents had inhabited, that represented the accumulated achievement of a century of community life, were simply walked away from. The Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 CE, one of the most severe and prolonged dry periods in the Southwest climatic history, is the most commonly cited explanation. 23 years without adequate rainfall, without enough water to maintain the agricultural system that fed the population, would have been catastrophic. And the evidence suggests that the drought was indeed severe. Tree ring records from the southwest, which extend back for thousands of years with remarkable precision, confirm the severity and duration of this particular dry period. But drought alone may not be the complete answer. The Southwest had experienced droughts before. Communities had survived them, sometimes by moving to areas with more reliable water, sometimes by intensifying their agricultural systems, sometimes by drawing on stored surpluses and exchange networks. The abandonment of the entire Mesa Verde region, rather than a strategic withdrawal to better watered locations within the region, suggests something more than simple resource stress. Some researchers point to social fragmentation, to the breakdown of the community bonds that had allowed people to cooperate effectively in managing water, food storage, and collective defense. Others suggest that by the late 1200s, the population of the Mesa Verde region had simply exceeded the carrying capacity of the local environment, even in good years, and that the drought merely accelerated the collapse of a system already under fundamental stress. And there are more unsettling theories. Some of the archaeological evidence from the late occupation period at Mesa Verde and nearby sites includes signs of extreme violence. Not the violence of warfare, but something that looks, to the archaeologists who have studied it carefully, like evidence of social breakdown of a severe kind. Human remains showing signs of processing that suggests the consumption of human flesh. Burned villages, skeletal assemblages consistent with massacre. Whatever happened in the final decades of Mesa Verde occupation, it was not simply a peaceful decision to relocate. Something went wrong in a deep and fundamental way. The descendants of the Mesa Verde people are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. The Hopi, the Zuni, the various Rio Grande Pueblos all trace their ancestry through a complex and not fully mapped web of migrations to the ancestral Puebloan world that included Mesa Verde and Chaco and the hundreds of smaller communities in between. For them, Mesa Verde and Chaco are not lost civilizations in the way that, say, Cahokia is lost. They are ancestral homelands, places of deep spiritual significance, places that are still connected through oral tradition and religious ceremony to the living communities of the Pueblo world. But the monuments remain. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the great houses of Chaco, the earthwork complexes of Ohio, the mound city of Cahokia. They remain in the landscape, and they continue to ask questions that we have not yet fully answered. We have not yet talked about one of the most extraordinary water management systems in the ancient world, built in the Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona, by a people called the Hohokam, who dug hundreds of miles of irrigation canals through the desert floor to bring the water of the Salt and Gila rivers to their fields of corn and cotton and agave. We have not talked about the Poverty Point site in Louisiana, a geometric earthwork complex dating to roughly 1,700 BCE, nearly 2,000 years before the Hopewell culture, built by people who may have gathered seasonally at this site from communities spread across the lower Mississippi Valley. We have not talked about the Watson Brake complex in Louisiana, a circle of earthen mounds connected by low ridges dating to approximately 3,500 BCE, which makes it older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids, and which represents the oldest known earthwork complex in the Western Hemisphere. We have barely scratched the surface. The pre-Columbian North American world was vastly more complex, more sophisticated, more connected, and more varied than the story we were taught in school. And the gap between that story and the reality that archaeology is revealing grows wider every decade, as new methods and new discoveries push the boundaries of what we know. Let us go to Louisiana now. Let us go back to the very beginning of the earthwork tradition. Let us talk about Watson Brake. In the rolling hills of northeastern Louisiana, where the forest presses close on all sides, and the air in summer carries a weight of moisture that settles on the skin like something alive, there is a site that most people have never heard of, a site that rewrote the history of North American civilization when it was first properly investigated in the 1990s. A site that pushes the origin of complex earthwork construction in the Americas back by more than 3,000 years, into a period so early that the people who built it had not yet developed agriculture, had not yet made pottery, had not yet adopted any of the technologies that we typically associate with the transition toward complex social organization. The Watson Break site consists of 11 earthen mounds arranged in an oval, connected by low ridges of earth that form a continuous circuit. The oval is roughly 800 feet across its long axis. The mounds at its perimeter range from about 3 feet to about 25 feet in height. And when archaeologists first began to suspect that this unassuming arrangement of grassy humps in the Louisiana landscape might be significantly older than the earthwork complexes they were already studying, they were so cautious about the implications that they subjected their dating evidence to unusually rigorous scrutiny. The dates came back consistent and unambiguous. The Watson Break earthworks were constructed beginning around 3500 BCE, with construction continuing for centuries. They are approximately 5,500 years old. 5,500 years old. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE, roughly 2,000 years after the people of Watson Break began constructing their earthwork complex. Stonehenge began its long construction history around 3000 BCE, still 500 years after Watson Break. The earliest cities of Mesopotamia, places like Uruk and Eridu, were beginning to develop around the same time that Watson Break was already an established ceremonial site in the Louisiana lowlands. We are not talking about a pre-agricultural society building small mounds. We are talking about a substantial engineering project, with mounds reaching 25 feet in height and connected by earthen ridges extending over hundreds of feet, constructed by a population that lived primarily by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plant foods, with no pottery, no domesticated crops, and apparently no permanent villages in the modern sense. How? How does a foraging society organize itself to build monuments of this scale? This is the question that archaeologists working at Watson Break have been wrestling with since the site's significance became clear, and the answers that have emerged are genuinely surprising. The key insight came from looking at the seasonal resources available in the Watson Break region. The Louisiana lowlands, in the period around 3500 BCE, were an extraordinarily productive environment. The rivers and wetlands teemed with fish and waterfowl. The forests provided abundant game. Wild plant foods were available in great variety across the seasons. And crucially, the distribution of these resources meant that certain locations, particularly the higher ground near the junction of major watercourses, would have been places where large numbers of people naturally converged during specific seasons, drawn by the same concentrations of food. The Watson Break site sits in exactly such a location, and the emerging picture is that the earthworks were not the product of a permanent community with a complex social hierarchy and organized labor. They were the product of a series of seasonal gatherings, of perhaps hundreds of people coming together periodically at a location that was already important as a meeting point and contributing labor to the gradual construction of earthworks that expressed and reinforced the significance of the place. Over generations, what began as a modest arrangement of earthen features became an increasingly substantial and deliberate complex. The mounds grew higher as each generation added to them. The connecting ridges became more continuous and more carefully maintained, and the whole complex became, over the centuries of its construction, a monument to the accumulated effort and meaning of generations of seasonal gatherings. This model of monument building without a state, without a hierarchical political structure, without even agriculture, has profound implications. It suggests that the capacity to create complex, deliberate, large-scale modifications to the landscape is not dependent on the political and economic structures that we typically associate with it. It is dependent, instead, on the existence of a shared meaning, a shared purpose, a shared understanding of why this place matters and why it is worth investing in. The people of Watson Break built their oval of mounds because the place was already sacred to them, already a gathering point, already a node in the web of relationships that connected their communities across the landscape. The earthworks were expressions of that existing significance, not the cause of it, And that is a very different story from the one we usually tell about monument building. Watson Break was not isolated in time or in space. In the centuries and millennia that followed its construction, other earthwork complexes appeared in the lower Mississippi Valley and the surrounding regions. Poverty Point, which we will visit shortly, was the largest and most complex of these later sites, built roughly 2,000 years after Watson Break, and representing a significant elaboration of the earthwork building tradition. And between Watson Break and Poverty Point, there were other sites, some now largely destroyed by agriculture and development, others still preserving enough of their original form to tell us something about the gradual elaboration of this tradition across the millennia. What is emerging from this research is a picture of the lower Mississippi Valley as one of the cradles of complex social organization in North America, a region where the extraordinary productivity of the wetland environment and the long-standing importance of certain locations as gathering places combined, over a very long span of time, to produce increasingly elaborate earthwork complexes that served as the physical anchors of far-flung social networks. This is a story that was largely invisible to researchers before the 1990s, partly because the sites are subtle and easily overlooked, and partly because the intellectual framework within which archaeologists were working made it difficult to imagine that foraging societies could build monuments of any significant scale. That framework has now been fundamentally revised. Watson Break and the sites that followed it have shown us that the capacity for large-scale monument building is one of the oldest characteristics of human society in the Americas, and that it does not require agriculture or state-level political organization as prerequisites. Now let us jump forward 2,000 years. Let us go from Watson Break to Poverty Point, a site that represents a spectacular fluorescence of the earthwork building tradition, and that poses mysteries of its own that researchers are still working to understand. Poverty Point is located in northeastern Louisiana, not far from Watson Break, in the same river-rich landscape that supported such extraordinary social complexity for so many thousands of years. It was constructed beginning around 1700 BCE, which places it firmly in the late Archaic period, still before the full adoption of agriculture by most of the societies of the eastern United States, and its scale is immediately apparent even to a casual observer. The main feature of Poverty Point is a series of concentric semicircular ridges, 6 of them, arranged in a vast arc facing the banks of Bayou Macon. The ridges are not natural. They were constructed from earth, each one originally about 3 to 6 feet tall and perhaps as much as 80 feet wide, with habitation surfaces on top of them where buildings once stood. The innermost ridge has a diameter of about half a mile, the outermost ridge has a diameter of more than a mile, and the total area enclosed within the outermost ridge is roughly 3/4 of a square mile. Within the arc of the ridges, there is a central plaza, a roughly level open space covering dozens of acres. And at the western edge of the complex, outside the arc of ridges, there are several large mounds, the largest of which, known as Mound A, is a massive bird effigy mound. Yes, a mound built in the shape of a bird, viewed from above, with wings outstretched, rising about 70 feet above the surrounding land surface and extending across several hundred feet in its longest dimension. The total volume of earth in Mound A alone is roughly comparable to that of some of the smaller Egyptian pyramids. The ridges of Poverty Point were apparently habitation platforms, raised surfaces on which the residents of the site lived. Artifacts, including food debris, fire-cracked rock used in cooking, and the remains of the distinctive Poverty Point objects, which we will discuss in a moment, are found abundantly on the ridge surfaces, suggesting that the ridges supported a substantial resident population. Estimates of the population of Poverty Point at its peak range from roughly 1,000 to several thousand people, which would have made it by far the largest settlement in North America at the time it was occupied. The Poverty Point objects are among the most distinctive artifacts of any pre-Columbian North American site. They are small lumps of baked clay, manufactured in a variety of geometric forms including spheres, biconical shapes, cylinders, and various combinations of these. They were produced in enormous quantities at Poverty Point, with archaeologists estimating that the site may have contained hundreds of thousands or even millions of them, and their purpose appears to have been to serve as a substitute for the cooking stones that were unavailable in the alluvial Louisiana landscape. In environments where stone is available, cooking fires were often managed using stone hearthstones that absorbed heat and then transferred it to food placed near them. In the stone-poor Louisiana lowlands, the people of Poverty Point manufactured small clay objects that could serve the same function. The variety of forms may reflect different cooking applications, with different shapes providing different heating characteristics for different cooking methods. It is a simple but elegant technological solution to a practical problem, and the scale of its adoption at Poverty Point tells us that the site supported a population engaged in serious food processing on a daily basis. But what truly distinguishes Poverty Point, and what connects it to the long tradition of earthwork building that we have been tracing tonight, is the sheer scale and deliberateness of its construction. The concentric ridges are not natural features, they were built. The plaza between them was not a natural open area, it was maintained. The mounds, including the spectacular bird effigy of Mound A, were constructed from enormous quantities of earth that had to be moved by human hands, and the entire complex was clearly laid out according to a coherent plan, with the geometry of the ridges and the positioning of the major mounds reflecting a level of spatial planning that goes far beyond anything that spontaneous community growth would produce. Poverty Point was also a major node in a long-distance exchange network that connected it to communities spread across a vast geographic area. Stone tools and raw stone materials found at Poverty Point were sourced from quarries in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, from outcrops in the Tennessee River Valley in Alabama and Tennessee, from sources on the upper Mississippi River, and from even more distant locations. Copper has been found at Poverty Point, originating from the same Lake Superior sources that would later supply the Hopewell network nearly 2,000 years in the future. Galena, a lead ore used as a pigment, came from sources in Missouri and Illinois. Soapstone vessels, which were used for cooking before pottery became widespread, were imported from sources in Alabama and Georgia. The distances involved in this exchange network are, again, striking when you consider that everything was moved by human carriers or by dugout canoe. The Ozark Mountains are more than 400 miles from Poverty Point. The Tennessee River Valley is even farther, and yet materials from these sources appear at Poverty Point in quantities that suggest regular and substantial movement of goods over these distances. What was moving in the other direction? What did Poverty Point have to offer that was valuable enough to motivate communities hundreds of miles away to engage in this long-distance exchange? We do not know for certain. The materials that Poverty Point might have exported, food surpluses, perishable goods, knowledge, ritual services, relationships, are largely invisible in the archaeological record. But the existence of the incoming materials is clear evidence that Poverty Point occupied a position of significance in a regional exchange network, that it had something to offer that its distant trading partners valued. Poverty Point was occupied from roughly 1700 to 1100 BCE, and then, like Watson Brake before it and like all the great complexes we have been visiting tonight, it was abandoned. The reasons are not clear. There is no evidence of catastrophic violence or sudden disaster. The site seems to have been depopulated gradually, the population dispersing back into the surrounding landscape as the social and ideological structures that had maintained the community cohesion dissolved. After Poverty Point, the earthwork building tradition in Louisiana and the surrounding region entered a quieter period. Communities continued to construct small mounds, continued to participate in long-distance exchange, continued to develop and maintain the ceremonial traditions that connected them to a broader world. But nothing on the scale of Poverty Point appeared again in this region for several centuries. The extraordinary concentration of population and social energy that had produced Poverty Point dissolved back into the broader landscape, leaving only the mounds and the ridges and the bird effigy of Mound A to testify to what had once been here. We will return to the lower Mississippi Valley and to the broader story of the mound building tradition as this video continues. But first, let us step back even further from the specific sites and think about the broader picture that is emerging from all of this evidence. Because there is a pattern here, across all the different civilizations and all the different eras and all the different regions we have been exploring tonight, a pattern that tells us something important about the nature of the pre-Columbian North American world that we were never taught in school. The pattern is this: complex social organization, large-scale construction, long-distance exchange networks, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, elaborate ceremonial traditions, and genuine artistic achievement appear again and again across the pre-Columbian North American world, in settings as different as the Louisiana wetlands and the Colorado Canyon country and the Illinois prairies and the Ohio River Valley. They appear at different times, in different cultural contexts, using different materials and different techniques, but they appear repeatedly, persistently, across a span of time that extends from at least 3,500 BCE to roughly 1,400 CE, more than 4,000 years of pre-Columbian complexity that our conventional narratives have systematically minimized or ignored. Why have we not been taught this story? Why is it that most Americans can tell you about the pyramids of Egypt but cannot name a single site from the Hopewell culture? Why is it that most American school children learn about the Roman road system but never hear about the roads of Chaco Canyon? Why is it that Monk's Mound, the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere, sits in a suburb of one of the largest cities in the United States and is essentially unknown to the general public? The answers to these questions are uncomfortable, and they involve the history of how archaeology was practiced in the United States and how the findings of that archaeology were, for many decades, selectively communicated to the public. They involve the assumption, which was not always conscious but was nonetheless pervasive, that the ancestors of contemporary indigenous North American peoples could not have been capable of the achievements that the mounds and the earthworks and the cities and the road systems clearly represented, and they involve the long shadow of the mound builder myth, one of the most persistent and most damaging pieces of pseudo-history in American intellectual culture. We need to talk about the mound builder myth, because to understand why these civilizations are so little known today, you have to understand how they were misrepresented and appropriated for nearly a century of American history. When European Americans began moving into the Ohio Valley in large numbers in the late 18th century, they encountered a landscape scattered with earthen mounds of all shapes and sizes. These mounds were obviously artificial. They were too regular in form, too deliberately placed, too numerous to be natural features, and their size, with some of the largest reaching 40 or 50 feet in height and covering acres of ground, made them clearly the product of organized human effort on a substantial scale. The question that immediately arose was, who built them? And here is where the story takes a dark and revealing turn. Rather than asking that question of the indigenous peoples who were already living near the mounds, many of whom had traditions and oral histories that connected them to the mound-building past, many European American commentators and early researchers assumed, almost without examination, that the mounds could not have been built by the ancestors of the people they called Indians. The reasoning, such as it was, ran roughly like this: the mounds are impressive. The Indians we see today do not build things this impressive. Therefore, someone else must have built the mounds. Who was that someone else? The answers offered were as varied as they were baseless. The mounds were built by a vanished race of giants, by refugees from the lost continent of Atlantis, by Welsh settlers who came to the Americas in the 12th century, by the lost tribes of Israel, by Phoenician navigators, by Hindu priests, by Scandinavian Vikings, by any number of ancient peoples who were presumed, for no particular reason beyond the prejudices of the time, to have been more capable of achievement than the indigenous people of North America. This body of mythology and pseudo-history is what scholars call the mound builder myth. And it was not just a fringe belief, it was mainstream. It appeared in serious books, in respectable publications, in the congressional records of the United States, and in the rhetoric of political figures who used the supposed mystery of the mounds to argue that the indigenous peoples of North America had no authentic historical claim to the land, because even the land's most impressive monuments had been built by someone else, a lost race who had been destroyed by the savage ancestors of the contemporary Indians, and whose memory and whose land it was now the destiny of European civilization to reclaim and honor. This is not ancient history. This way of thinking shaped United States Indian policy for much of the 19th century. It was used to justify removal. It was used to justify the dispossession of peoples from their ancestral lands. And it was profoundly, demonstrably wrong. The man who did the most to refute the mound builder myth and establish the scientific foundation for understanding who actually built the mounds was Cyrus Thomas, a government scientist who led the Division of Mound Exploration of the Bureau of Ethnology in the 1880s. Thomas and his team spent years conducting systematic excavations at mound sites across the eastern United States, carefully documenting what they found and comparing it to the material culture and oral traditions of contemporary indigenous peoples. Their conclusions, published in a landmark 1894 report, were clear and unambiguous. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North America. There was no lost race of mound builders. There never had been. The mounds were the work of people whose descendants were still living near them, whose cultural traditions still connected them to the mound-building past, and who had, in many cases, never forgotten what the mounds were or who had made them. This finding did not, unfortunately, immediately or completely dispel the mound builder myth. Elements of it persisted in popular culture throughout the 20th century and persist in some quarters even today. But it did establish the scientific baseline from which modern North American archaeology has developed. And the story that modern archaeology has been uncovering, the story we have been telling tonight, is far more interesting and far more remarkable than any of the fantasies that the mound builder myth offered in its place. Because the truth is that the ancestors of contemporary indigenous North Americans built structures of extraordinary scale and sophistication. They developed astronomical knowledge of a very high order. They created artistic traditions of genuine beauty and complexity. They established trade and exchange networks that spanned the continent. They organized communities and polities of real sophistication. They did all of this over a period of thousands of years, across dozens of cultural traditions in every part of the continent. And they did it without any of the outside help that the mound builder myth invented for them. That is a remarkable story. That is a story worth telling and retelling. And the fact that it is still not widely known, that most Americans still do not learn it in school, that the sites that embody it are still underfunded and undervisited and underappreciated, is a cultural failure that we are slowly, imperfectly, beginning to address. Now let us return to the sites themselves, because we have not yet talked about the Serpent Mound of Ohio, which is one of the most mysterious and beautiful earthworks in the world, and which has a story all its own that deserves careful attention. The Great Serpent Mound of Adams County, Ohio, is an effigy mound, an earthwork built in the form of an animal. Specifically, it is built in the form of a serpent, more than 1,300 feet long, coiling in 7 great curves across the top of a natural ridge above a creek valley. The serpent's tail is a tightly coiled spiral. Its body curves back and forth in graceful undulations, and its head, which some researchers interpret as open-mouthed and some interpret as containing a figure, faces toward the setting sun at the summer solstice. The Serpent Mound is not a burial mound. Very few burials have been found in it. It is something else, something whose purpose and meaning remain genuinely uncertain. It is an image, a representation, a figure drawn in earth at a scale that, like the Nazca lines of Peru, can only be fully appreciated from the air. From the ground, walking along the ridge where the mound sits, you can see the individual curves of the body, the careful shaping of the earthen form, but you cannot see the whole. You cannot see the serpent. To see what the builders saw when they imagined this creation, you need altitude. You need a perspective that the Hopewell people, or whoever built this mound, did not have in any physical sense. And yet they built it. They built a figure that is meaningful only from a perspective they could never occupy physically. Why? This is the question that haunts the Serpent Mound, What did it mean to build something of this scale? Something that can only be fully seen by a being capable of flight, or by a deity looking down from the sky. Was the serpent mound meant for human viewing at all? Was it a message, or a monument, or a sacred ground to be walked rather than viewed? Was the experience of moving through its curves, of feeling the body of the serpent underfoot, the point, rather than any distant viewing of the whole? The astronomical alignments of the serpent mound add another layer to the mystery. The head of the serpent aligns with the summer solstice sunset, the coiled tail aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, and the overall orientation of the mound's long axis appears to encode additional astronomical relationships. Researchers have been debating and refining these astronomical interpretations for decades, and the picture that emerges is of a structure that was deliberately oriented to the cosmos, to the movements of the sun, in a way that connected the earthly form of the serpent to the cyclic rhythms of the sky. The serpent is a powerful and widespread symbol in the spiritual traditions of indigenous North America, appearing in diverse forms and contexts across the continent. In the traditions of many eastern woodlands peoples, the great horned serpent is a being of immense power, a creature of the underwater world that stands in opposition to the thunderbird of the sky world. The serpent lives in rivers and lakes. It causes floods. It can heal. It can kill. It is one of the fundamental organizing symbols of a cosmological system that divides the universe into sky world and underwater world, with the surface of the earth, where human beings live, as the mediating zone between them. If the serpent mound embodies this cosmological serpent, then it is not merely an image but a sacred technology, a means of anchoring a being of enormous spiritual power to a specific place in the landscape, of marking a location as one where the boundaries between worlds are thin, where the power of the cosmic serpent is present and accessible. This interpretation is supported by the natural geology of the site, because the ridge on which the serpent mound was built was created by a meteor impact roughly 300 million years ago, an event that shattered and disrupted the rock in a distinctive circular pattern. The Hopewell people could not have known what had happened there, but they may have recognized that the disturbed geology created a visible anomaly in the landscape, a place where the earth itself was different, where the usual rules of the natural world did not quite apply. Places where the earth is different, where the landscape is anomalous, where the boundaries between worlds might be expected to be thin. These are precisely the kinds of places that many indigenous spiritual traditions regard as sacred and powerful. The choice of this particular ridge for this particular earthwork may reflect an understanding of the landscape, an ability to read its spiritual geography that we have lost the tools to fully appreciate. The serpent mound was probably built by the Hopewell people sometime between 100 BCE and 500 CE, though some researchers have argued for a later date, suggesting it was built by the Fort Ancient culture that occupied the region after the Hopewell florescence. The question of when it was built matters for understanding what tradition it belongs to and how to interpret its meaning. But the question has not been definitively resolved, partly because the mound itself has been restored and partially reconstructed at various points in its history, making it difficult to obtain reliable dating materials from its interior. Whatever its precise date, the Serpent Mound is one of the most powerful and evocative prehistoric monuments in North America. It sits on its ridge above the creek, curling through its 7 great undulations, its head pointing toward the setting midsummer sun, its tail coiled in on itself like a thought returning to its own beginning. It asks questions that archaeology can approach but not fully answer, and it invites a kind of contemplation that the best of these ancient sites provoke, a sense of being in the presence of minds that were working with categories and concerns that we can recognize as deeply human but cannot quite translate into our own frameworks of understanding. This is the experience that the great pre-Columbian monuments of North America offer, for those willing to approach them with patience and humility, not the simple amazement of encountering the inexplicably large, which tends to dissolve into a comfortable wonder and then fade, but the more persistent and more productive discomfort of encountering the genuinely unknown, of standing in the presence of human achievement and realizing that you cannot quite account for it. that the frameworks within which you understand the past do not fully contain it, that the story is more complicated and more interesting and more full of things you do not know than you had previously imagined. That discomfort is an invitation. It is an invitation to look more carefully, to learn more, to revise your assumptions, to ask better questions. It is, in the end, the most valuable thing that these ancient sites have to offer us. Not answers, better questions. And we are far from done with the questions tonight. We have not yet talked about Serpent Mound's neighbors in the Ohio Valley. We have not talked about the Newark works in their full complexity, the relationship between the geometric enclosures and the burial mounds and the road system that connected them. We have not talked about the sheer quantity of earthworks that once existed in Ohio before agriculture and development destroyed most of them. By some estimates, there were once more than 10,000 individual earthen mounds in Ohio alone, ranging from small conical burial mounds a few feet high to enormous platform mounds and geometric enclosures covering multiple acres. Most of them are gone now, plowed flat by farmers who found them inconvenient, quarried for road fill, leveled by developers, lost in a wave of destruction that swept through the eastern United States beginning in the early 19th century and accelerating throughout the 20th. What we have lost is genuinely incalculable. Every mound that was destroyed without proper excavation took with it information that can never be recovered. Every geometric enclosure plowed flat eliminated a data point in the astronomical record that those earthworks embodied. Every burial mound disturbed by treasure hunters or curiosity seekers lost the contextual information, the spatial relationships between objects, the evidence of ritual practice that gives burial goods their meaning as historical documents. We are working, as North American archaeologists work, from fragments, from the small percentage of sites that were preserved and studied before they were destroyed, from the evidence that survives in the ground beneath modern cities and farms and highways, from the oral traditions of indigenous peoples whose ancestors built these monuments, and from the handful of sites that still stand, still visible, still available to the patient and attentive researcher. But even from fragments, the picture that emerges is extraordinary, and in the last several decades, new technologies have begun to fill in some of the gaps that the destruction of physical sites has left behind. Let us talk about LiDAR, and what it has been revealing about the hidden complexity of the pre-Columbian North American landscape. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it is a technology that has quietly transformed our understanding of the pre-Columbian world in ways that are only beginning to be fully appreciated. The basic principle is simple. A sensor mounted on an aircraft emits millions of laser pulses per second at the ground below. The time it takes for each pulse to return to the sensor tells you the precise elevation of the surface it bounced off. By collecting hundreds of millions of these data points over a large area, you can build a three-dimensional map of the landscape with extraordinary precision, accurate to within a few centimeters in elevation. The revolutionary capability of LiDAR for archaeology comes from its ability to penetrate vegetation. The laser pulses can pass through gaps in forest canopy and record the elevation of the actual ground surface beneath the trees, rather than the surface of the canopy. This means that archaeologists can now map landscapes that are covered by dense forest, landscapes that would require years of difficult and expensive ground survey to map manually, and see the underlying topography with a clarity that was simply impossible before. What they have been finding, in forest after forest across eastern North America and the southwest and the southeast, is that the pre-Columbian landscape was far more extensively modified by human activity than anyone previously realized. Features that had been invisible beneath the forest canopy, features that ground-level observers walking through the trees could not detect, are suddenly visible in LiDAR imagery as subtle but unmistakable patterns in the topography. In Louisiana, LiDAR surveys of the forests in the region around Poverty Point revealed that the site was far larger than previously understood, with features extending into areas that had been thought to contain only natural topography. In the Ohio Valley, LiDAR surveys have revealed the existence of earthwork complexes that were completely unknown to archaeologists. Buried beneath centuries of vegetation growth and erosion, their forms softened but still detectably non-natural in the precision of their geometry. In the Maya lowlands of Central America, LiDAR surveys revealed in 2018 that the ancient Maya world was far more densely populated and far more extensively developed than any previous model had suggested, with an estimated 11 million people living in a landscape that was far more completely modified by agriculture, water management, and urban infrastructure than anyone had imagined. The announcement of those findings made international headlines and forced a fundamental revision of how archaeologists understood the pre-classic and classic Maya world. Similar revisions are beginning to happen in North American archaeology as LiDAR data becomes more widely available and more carefully analyzed. The scale of the earthwork landscape across the eastern United States is becoming clear for the first time, and it is substantially larger and more complex than the maps and inventories compiled from ground surveys and historical records had suggested. There are more sites. There are more connections between sites. There are more roads, more berms, more modified topographic features of all kinds than the pre-LiDAR archaeological record had documented. This does not mean that LiDAR is revealing lost cities or hidden civilizations in the dramatic sense that some popular media have suggested. The sites that LiDAR is revealing are, in most cases, extensions and elaborations of things that archaeologists already knew about. They are confirmation and amplification, not revelation from nothing. But the amplification is itself significant, because it means that the pre-Columbian North American world was, in terms of sheer scale of landscape modification, even more impressively built up than we had previously understood. The Hohokam of the Sonoran Desert are a case study in what LiDAR and careful archaeological analysis can reveal about the hidden complexity of ancient water management systems. The Hohokam people occupied the Salt and Gila River valleys of what is now central Arizona from roughly 300 to 1500 CE. And during that period, they constructed one of the most extensive irrigation canal systems in the pre-Columbian world, a network of canals that has been estimated to have totaled more than 500 miles in length, channeling the water of the Salt and Gila rivers through the desert landscape to irrigate fields that could support tens of thousands of people in a region that today requires enormous engineered infrastructure to support its 21st century population. The Hohokam canals were not simple ditches. They were sophisticated engineered channels, carefully designed with gradients that maintained appropriate water flow velocities, with banks strong enough to contain the channel even during high water events, with gate structures and distribution systems that allowed water to be directed to specific fields. The largest of the Hohokam canals were wide enough and deep enough to require significant construction effort to build and regular maintenance effort to keep clear of silt and debris, and the system as a whole required coordination between communities spread across the valley floor, communities that had to agree on water rights and maintenance responsibilities and gate schedules and all the other details of managing a shared water resource. Phoenix, Arizona, the modern city that now occupies much of the territory that the Hohokam once irrigated, was built in part on the ancient Hohokam canal alignments. Some of the modern canals that water Phoenix today follow routes originally surveyed and dug by Hohokam canal builders 1,000 or more years ago. The engineers who laid out the modern Phoenix irrigation system in the late 19th century, encountering the remnants of the Hohokam canal network, found the ancient alignments so well chosen that they used them as templates for their own construction. Think about that for a moment. Modern engineers, with all the surveying technology and hydraulic knowledge available to them in the late 19th century, looked at canals built by a pre-Columbian desert people more than 1,000 years before, and concluded that those ancient builders had made the right choices. They could not have done better. The gradient was correct. The alignment was optimal. The Hohokam had solved the problem of watering the Salt River Valley with a precision that modern engineering confirmed. The Hohokam also built platform mounds, large flat-topped earthen platforms that supported important community buildings and may have served ceremonial functions similar to those proposed for the platform mounds of Cahokia. They played the ballgame on courts of a form found across a vast swath of pre-Columbian North America from the southwest through the southeast, suggesting cultural connections to Mesoamerica where the ballgame originated. They produced a distinctive red-on-buff pottery that is one of the most recognizable ceramic traditions of the ancient Southwest. And they created an extraordinary tradition of shell, jewelry, and ornament, using marine shells obtained from trade with communities on the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast that represents some of the finest shell art of the ancient American world. And then, around 1450 CE, the Hohokam society, as archaeologists define it, ceased to exist. Not the people. The people remained, and their descendants became the Odin people of the modern Sonoran Desert. But the organizational structure, the canal management system, the platform mounds, the ball courts, the distinctive artistic traditions, all of these disappeared within a relatively short period. What happened? The evidence points to a confluence of crises. A major flood around 1358 CE damaged the canal system catastrophically, and the social and political structure required to repair it may have already been under stress. Prolonged drought in the late 14th and early 15th centuries made agricultural production increasingly uncertain. Social tensions within the Hohokam community may have been increasing, as evidenced by archaeological signs of conflict and community disruption in the final occupation phases. And the combination of these factors appears to have been sufficient to collapse a system that had sustained a large and complex desert society for more than 1,000 years. The story of the Hohokam is in some ways the most directly relevant to the modern United States of all the stories we are telling tonight. Because Phoenix, one of the fastest growing cities in the 21st century, sits on the ruins of a desert civilization that managed water in a landscape of near desert for more than a millennium. A civilization that figured out how to sustain tens of thousands of people in conditions not fundamentally different from those that Phoenix faces today, before concrete and air conditioning and automobile infrastructure were available to make the desert feel manageable. A civilization that collapsed, at least in part, because the water system that sustained it was damaged and could not be fully repaired. The Hohokam have things to teach us. Their canal system, their agricultural practices, their ways of organizing water management across a community represent thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to live in the Sonoran Desert. Some of that knowledge has been lost, as the Hohokam organizational system dissolved in the 15th century, and the communities that emerged from it developed along different lines. But some of it is preserved in the practices and traditions of the Odin people who are the Hohokam's descendants, in the archaeological record of the Hohokam system that researchers are still studying, and in the landscape itself, where the ancient canal alignments still shape the water management infrastructure of modern Phoenix. We tend to think of ancient civilizations as belonging to the past, as things that happened before our story began, but the Hohokam are not in the past. They are in the ground beneath Phoenix. They are in the bloodlines of the Odin. They are in the canal alignments that still carry water through the desert. They are present in fragments and echoes and material remains in the same landscape where millions of 21st century Americans are trying to figure out how to live in the desert without running out of water. The past is not gone, it is waiting to be read. Now let us move to the Pacific Northwest and talk about a very different kind of civilization, one that built its complexity not in earth and stone, but in social organization and material culture and the extraordinary productivity of the coastal environment. And let us talk about the remarkable structures that Northwest Coast peoples created, structures that challenge our assumptions about what complexity requires. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast, from what is now Northern California to Southern Alaska, developed one of the most complex and culturally rich societies in the pre-Columbian world without ever practicing agriculture in the conventional sense. The salmon runs of the Pacific coastal rivers, the abundance of marine mammals, shellfish, and other marine resources, and the extraordinary productivity of the temperate rainforest provided a food base so reliable and so abundant that large, permanent villages were possible without farming. And in those villages, the peoples of the Northwest Coast developed a social system, an artistic tradition, a ceremonial life, and an approach to the accumulation and distribution of wealth that has fascinated anthropologists and art historians for more than a century. The Great Plank Houses of the northwest coast were remarkable structures in their own right. Built from the enormous western red cedar trees that dominated the coastal forest, these structures could reach 100 feet or more in length and 30 or 40 feet in width. Their frames were massive horizontal cedar beams supported by vertical posts, with the exterior walls and roof covered by overlapping cedar planks, split from straight-grained logs. Inside, the house was divided into family sections arranged around a central hearth, with sleeping platforms built along the walls and storage above and below. A large house might shelter 20 or 30 or more individuals, representing a high-ranking chief's household, with all its members, dependents, and servants. The entrances to the great houses were often marked by carved totem poles or entrance figures, and the interior walls and posts were decorated with painted and carved images representing the family's ancestral crests, the supernatural beings and animals from whom the family claimed descent, and whose power and prestige were encoded in the right to display these images. The entire built environment of a northwest coast village was a statement of social position and ancestral connection, with every carved post and painted screen and woven blanket and decorated cedar box contributing to a visual program that articulated who you were and where you stood in a hierarchical social order. The potlatch ceremony, which was and remains central to the cultural life of many Northwest Coast peoples, was the mechanism through which this hierarchical social order was maintained, challenged, and renegotiated. In a potlatch, a chief hosted a great feast and gave away enormous quantities of wealth, redistributing the accumulated resources of the household to guests from other communities in a public demonstration of generosity that simultaneously confirmed and enhanced the host's prestige. The guests, by accepting the gifts, acknowledged the host's rank, and they were obligated to reciprocate with potlatches of their own in a cycle of competitive gift-giving that mobilized enormous quantities of wealth and kept the resources of the regional economy in constant circulation. The objects created for potlatch exchange and display represent some of the finest artistic achievement of the pre-Columbian world. Carved wooden boxes and bowls, woven blankets whose manufacture required months of labor and extraordinary technical skill, carved and painted wooden masks representing supernatural beings, masks so carefully engineered that they could be opened and closed during ceremony to reveal inner faces, or that incorporated moving parts operated by the dancer to create dramatic visual effects. Copper shields of distinctive form, known simply as coppers, that accumulated prestige through the history of their ownership and could be worth the equivalent of thousands of blankets. Carved wooden figures of ancestor beings so powerfully rendered that generations of non-indigenous observers have placed them alongside the finest sculpture of any tradition in any civilization. The Northwest Coast peoples did not build pyramids or irrigation systems or road networks in the way that the Mississippian and southwestern and eastern woodlands peoples we have been discussing tonight did. Their monuments were different. They were monuments of social complexity, of artistic achievement, of ceremonial sophistication. They represent a different answer to the question of what human beings do when they have enough food and enough time and enough organizational capacity to do something more than simply survive. The answer the Northwest Coast peoples gave was, we build a world of extraordinary beauty and intricate social meaning. We create art that encodes our relationships with the supernatural world and with each other. We develop ceremonies that dramatize and reinforce the values and hierarchies that hold our communities together. We tell stories, through the carved and painted surfaces of every object we make, about who we are and where we come from. That is a civilization, maybe not one that looks like what we were taught to expect, but a civilization nonetheless. And now let us turn our attention back to the eastern part of the continent, and to a mystery that has puzzled researchers for more than 2 centuries, and that remains one of the most debated questions in North American archaeology. The mystery of the copper. The mystery of what happened at the mines of Lake Superior before recorded history, and the mystery of where all that copper went. On the shores of Lake Superior, in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, and on the island of Isle Royale in the middle of the lake, there are mines. Not modern mines, though modern copper mining has been conducted in this region as well. Ancient mines. Pits and trenches and shafts dug into the copper-bearing rock of the Lake Superior Basin, worked by human hands for thousands of years before European contact. Mines so numerous and so extensive that when they were first encountered by European Americans in the 19th century, researchers estimated that they contained evidence of the removal of hundreds of millions of pounds of native copper, a soft and malleable form of nearly pure metallic copper that occurs naturally in this region in quantities unmatched anywhere else in the world. Native copper is extraordinary stuff. It is soft enough to be worked cold, by hammering and annealing, without smelting, without furnaces, without any of the high-temperature metallurgical processes that we associate with metal working in most of the ancient world. You can pick up a piece of native copper and, with stone hammers and antler punches, work it into a desired shape by cold hammering it, heating it briefly in a fire to restore its workability when it becomes brittle, and then hammering it some more. The process is labor-intensive, but it is accessible to any society that has access to the material and a basic understanding of how to work it. And the Lake Superior region has native copper in abundance, in quantities that are, on a global scale, essentially unique. The mines of Lake Superior were being worked by human beings at least 5,000 years ago, and possibly considerably earlier. The peak of mining activity appears to have occurred roughly between 3000 and 1000 BCE, during the period that archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex, when communities across the upper Midwest were producing an extraordinary variety of copper tools and ornaments. During this period, the miners of Lake Superior extracted enormous quantities of copper from the bedrock of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Using techniques that were simple but effective, they heated the copper-bearing rock with fire and then quenched it rapidly with water, causing it to crack along natural fractures. They pried out the resulting pieces of rock and copper with wooden and stone tools. They sorted the material, keeping the pieces with high copper content and discarding the waste rock, which accumulated in enormous piles that are still visible today. The quantities involved are staggering. Estimates of the total copper removed from the Lake Superior mines during the period of prehistoric exploitation range from roughly $500 million to more than £1 billion. These estimates are based on the volume of the mining pits and the quantity of waste rock left behind. They carry significant uncertainty, but even the most conservative estimate represents an amount of metal that would have required an enormous investment of labor over a very long period of time. Where did all this copper go? Some of it, clearly, was used locally. The old copper complex of the upper Midwest is characterized by copper tools of many kinds, projectile points and spear points, and fish hooks and awls and knives and celts, implements of a size and robustness that suggests they were intended for heavy use rather than purely ceremonial display. These are the objects of a society that was putting its copper to practical work, using a material that was abundant and workable in the local environment to meet the needs of daily life. But the copper did not stay in the upper Midwest. It traveled far, far south and east and west of its sources in the Lake Superior Basin. Copper objects made from this distinctive material appear in archaeological contexts that span the continent. Old copper objects have been found in Florida. Hopewell copper ornaments, made from the same Lake Superior material, have been found in Arkansas and Louisiana and as far west as Kansas. Mississippian period copper objects appear in burial mounds across the southeast. The copper of Lake Superior traveled, across the centuries and the millennia, through trade networks of continental scale, to end up as grave goods in the burial mounds of people who lived hundreds or thousands of miles from its source. The sheer quantity of copper that was extracted and then distributed across such vast distances implies a level of organization and sustained effort that is difficult to account for within our conventional understanding of pre-Columbian North American societies. The mining itself required not just the labor of digging, but the management of water that accumulated in the deeper pits, the development of techniques for cracking copper-bearing rock and extracting the metal, the organization of the resulting material for further processing or trade, and the maintenance of the social relationships and exchange networks that moved the copper to its ultimate destinations. We do not have detailed knowledge of how the Lake Superior mining operations were organized. We do not know whether they were controlled by specific communities, whether they were operated by specialists, whether different groups had claims to different parts of the mining area, or whether the mines were worked by many different communities on a seasonal or occasional basis. The archaeological record of the mining sites is fragmentary and poorly preserved, because the subsequent phases of European and American copper mining in the same area have destroyed much of what might have survived. But the scale of the operation and the distances over which its products traveled tells us something important. It tells us that for thousands of years before European contact, the Lake Superior copper mines were a hub in a continental-scale economic system, a source of a valued material that connected communities across North America through webs of trade and exchange. It tells us that the people who controlled access to this resource, or who participated in the networks that moved it southward and eastward, were participants in a genuinely continental economy. And the copper tells us something else, something about the nature of value in the pre-Columbian world. Copper was not valued primarily because it was useful. The tools of the old copper complex were practical, yes, but stone tools worked perfectly well for most of the same purposes, and stone was available everywhere, while copper required long-distance trade. Copper was valued because it was beautiful, because it was rare in most of the continent's regions, because it had a warm, glowing color that was associated in many indigenous spiritual traditions with the sun and with divine power. Because wearing copper or possessing copper objects marked you as someone with connections to distant places, connections to the exchange networks through which prestige and power flowed as freely as the metal itself. This is a sophisticated understanding of value. It is an understanding that transcends the purely practical, that operates in the realm of the social and the symbolic, that recognizes that the value of an object lies not only in what it can do, but in what it means, and who you are when you possess it. This is not primitive economics. This is the economics of prestige, of status, of social connection that operates in complex societies the world over. The copper trade is one thread in a much larger tapestry of long-distance exchange that characterized the pre-Columbian North American world. Let us pull a few more of those threads and see what they reveal. Obsidian, the black volcanic glass that makes the sharpest cutting edges of any natural material, was quarried at Obsidian Cliff in what is now Yellowstone National Park and traded across hundreds of miles to communities in the eastern United States, where it appeared in Hopewell burial mounds more than 1,000 miles from its source. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico appeared in burial contexts in the Great Lakes region. Mica from the southern Appalachians turned up in Ohio. Shark teeth from the Atlantic coast appeared in inland Ohio burial mounds. Soapstone vessels from Appalachian quarries traveled south and west to communities in the Mississippi Valley. Catlinite, the distinctive red pipestone quarried at a sacred site in what is now Minnesota, moved across the continent in the form of carved pipes that were used in ceremonies from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Each of these materials followed its own trade routes, was embedded in its own web of social relationships, and carried its own associations of meaning and power. Together, they tell us that the pre-Columbian North American world was, in terms of its connectivity and its economic and social complexity, something very different from the image of isolated, simple communities that our conventional narratives have presented. Communities across the continent were in contact with each other. They were trading. They were exchanging not just goods but ideas, artistic styles, ceremonial practices, technological knowledge. The symbolic vocabulary of the southeastern ceremonial complex appeared across an area stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf because communities from Ohio to Louisiana to Arkansas were participating in a shared ceremonial tradition. The effigy pipes of the Hopewell people are recognizable from Illinois to New York to Missouri because craftspeople working in all these places were working within a shared aesthetic tradition a shared understanding of what the pipes should look like and what they should represent. This is not isolation. This is a connected world. A world that had developed its own forms of complexity, its own networks of exchange and communication, its own traditions of knowledge and ceremony and art, over thousands of years of continuous development on this continent. A world that was, in its own terms and by its own measures, sophisticated and complex and interconnected in ways that the conventional narratives of pre-Columbian North American history have consistently failed to acknowledge. Now let us talk about something that very few people know about, and that is among the most remarkable stories in the entire history of pre-Columbian North America. Let us talk about the great Mississippian towns of the American Southeast. Not Cahokia, which we have already visited, but the dozens of other major Mississippian centers that existed across the Southeast from roughly 800 to 1600 CE, creating a world of platform mound towns and plaza complexes and regional polities that rivaled anything the contemporary medieval world of Europe had to offer. Let us talk, specifically, about a site called Etowah. Etowah mounds in northwestern Georgia sit on a bend of the Etowah River, surrounded by the ridges and valleys of the southern Appalachian foothills. The site is a complex of 6 platform mounds arranged around a central plaza, with evidence of extensive residential occupation in the surrounding area. The largest mound, Mound A, rises 63 feet above the plaza floor and covers nearly 3 acres at its base. It was built in stages over several centuries, with each major construction phase adding a new layer to its height and surface. At the top of Mound A, during the period of the site's greatest elaboration, there stood a wooden building of significant size that served as the residence and ceremonial space of the paramount chief who governed the Etowah polity. Etowah was occupied from roughly 1000 to 1550 CE, with its period of greatest complexity and power concentrated in the 11th through 14th centuries. During this period, it was the seat of a chiefdom that exercised authority over a substantial surrounding territory, extracting tribute from subordinate communities, organizing labor for construction projects, directing the production and distribution of prestige goods, and managing the ceremonial life that expressed and legitimized its authority. The burial mounds at Etowah, particularly a mound designated Mound C, have yielded some of the most extraordinary artifacts ever found in the pre-Columbian eastern United States. The burials in Mound C span several centuries of occupation and reflect the changing social conditions at Etowah over time, with the richest and most elaborate burials concentrated in specific periods that correspond to the site's phases of greatest power. Among the objects found in Mound C are 2 marble statues, a man and a woman, each about 2 feet tall, rendered in a naturalistic style that is unlike any other sculptural tradition in pre-Columbian eastern North America. These statues, known as the Etowah marble figures, depict individuals kneeling in positions that suggest ceremony or subordination, with detailed rendering of clothing, jewelry, and physical features. They were found near the remains of individuals of high status, suggesting that they served a function related to the commemoration or representation of specific people, perhaps ancestors or spiritual beings who were being invoked through their images. The Etowah site also yielded copper plates of extraordinary craftsmanship, repoussé work on thin copper sheets depicting figures in the iconographic vocabulary of the southeastern ceremonial complex, including the birdman warrior figure that we encountered at Cahokia. These plates were buried with high-status individuals and represent some of the finest metalwork of the pre-Columbian North American world. The skill required to produce them, to hammer thin copper into elaborate pictorial designs without tearing the metal, to create the fine detail of feathers and human faces and ceremonial clothing in a material that does not easily forgive mistakes, is genuinely impressive by any standard. Etowah was connected to a broader Mississippian world. The shared iconography of the southeastern ceremonial complex appeared at sites from Illinois to Florida to Oklahoma. Platform mound towns of the Mississippian pattern existed across the entire southeast and parts of the Midwest, from Cahokia in the north to sites in Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas. They were different from each other in many details, reflecting regional traditions and local political dynamics, but they shared a fundamental pattern of organization, a cluster of platform mounds around a central plaza, with the paramount chief's mound as the dominant feature of the landscape that reflects a shared set of ideas about how power should be organized and displayed. The Mississippian world was not a single empire or a unified political system. It was a mosaic of regional chiefdoms, each one organized around its central mound town, each one engaged in complex relationships of alliance and competition and tribute with its neighbors. Some of these chiefdoms were powerful enough to exercise authority over dozens of subordinate communities across wide territories. Others were smaller and more vulnerable to the ambitions of their more powerful neighbors. The political landscape was constantly shifting, as chiefdoms rose and fell and merged and fragmented in response to internal dynamics and external pressures. What held this diverse world together, what gave it coherence despite the absence of any unifying political authority, was the shared ceremonial tradition of the Southeastern ceremonial complex. The shared iconography, the shared ritual practices, the shared prestige goods that moved through the exchange networks linking Mississippian communities across the continent, all of these created a cultural framework that transcended political boundaries and connected communities that might otherwise have been entirely separate. When Hernando de Soto led the first major European expedition into the interior of the American Southeast in 1539 to 1542, he encountered this world at what may have been the height of its complexity, or possibly already in the early stages of a decline that would accelerate dramatically after European contact. His chroniclers described large towns with populations of thousands, surrounded by fields of corn and beans and squash extending for miles. They described paramount chiefs who were carried in litters by their subjects, whose authority extended over wide territories, who received tribute from subordinate communities in the form of food and labor and prestige goods. They described elaborate ceremonies and wooden temples on high mounds, and the veneration of honored dead. De Soto's expedition was catastrophically destructive. His soldiers killed and enslaved thousands of people. His pigs carried diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity, and those diseases spread far ahead of the expedition itself, devastating communities that the Spanish had not yet reached. The political structures that De Soto encountered were already, in some cases, in the process of being fatally undermined by epidemic disease before the Spanish sword was ever drawn. Within a century of European contact, most of the major Mississippian centers had been abandoned. The populations had collapsed, in many cases by more than 90%, in the waves of epidemic disease that swept through the continent following European arrival. The political systems that had organized these complex societies dissolved. The mound towns were abandoned, and by the time the first permanent English colonists arrived on the Atlantic coast in the early 17th century, the interior of the continent that they would eventually penetrate presented a very different picture from what De Soto had encountered less than a century before. But the mounds remained. The platform mounds of Etowah and of dozens of other Mississippian sites across the southeast remained in the landscape, still visible, still imposing, still asking questions that the diminished and traumatized communities living near them were no longer in a position to answer in the way their ancestors could have. And when European Americans began to encounter those mounds in the 18th and 19th centuries, they made the mistake we have already discussed. The mistake of assuming that such impressive structures could not have been built by the ancestors of the people they saw around them. That mistake, and the mythology it spawned, is itself a historical monument of a kind. A monument to the costs of refusing to look clearly at the evidence in front of you. A monument to the damage that prejudice does to the project of understanding the past. And a monument, in its way, to the extraordinary resilience of the pre-Columbian North American world, which was so thoroughly minimized and misrepresented for so long, and is now, slowly, beginning to be understood and appreciated as it deserves to be. Now let us step back from the specific sites and think about one of the most profound and persistent questions that the study of pre-Columbian North American civilizations raises. Not just who built these things and how, but why did they end? Because the pattern of rise and collapse that we have been tracing tonight, in culture after culture, site after site, across a span of thousands of years, is one of the most striking features of the pre-Columbian North American record. Watson Break, occupied for centuries, then abandoned. Poverty Point, home to thousands of people for 600 years, then depopulated. The Hopewell Network, perhaps the greatest cultural fluorescence of the eastern woodlands, lasting 600 years and then dissolving. Chaco, the organizing center of the Pueblo Southwest for 3 centuries, then abandoned. Mesa Verde, occupied for a century and then completely vacated. Cahokia, the largest city north of Mexico for 2 centuries, then gradually depopulated and ultimately abandoned. Etowah and the Mississippian world, destroyed not by internal dynamics alone, but by the catastrophic impact of European-introduced diseases that killed the majority of the population within a few generations. This record of collapse has sometimes been used to argue that pre-Columbian North American civilizations were somehow inherently unstable, somehow fatally flawed in their design, somehow incapable of achieving the kind of sustained development that led, in the Old World, to the continuous civilizations of Egypt and China and Mesopotamia. This argument is wrong, and it is worth understanding why it is wrong. Every complex society in human history has faced the challenge of sustainability. Many of them have failed. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed in the 12th century BCE in a wave of destruction whose causes are still debated. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE. The classic Maya civilization collapsed in the 9th century CE. The Khmer Empire of Southeast Asia declined dramatically in the 14th and 15th centuries CE. The Islamic Golden Age was ended by the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. Complex societies are inherently fragile. They depend on conditions, environmental and social and political, that can change. And when those conditions change in ways that the society cannot adapt to, collapse follows. The collapses of pre-Columbian North American civilizations fit entirely within this broader pattern of civilizational fragility. Hopewell probably ended because the social and ideological structures that had sustained its extraordinary network of communities began to break down under pressures that we do not yet fully understand. Chaco ended because a prolonged drought made the already marginal agricultural system of the canyon untenable. Mesa Verde ended because a similar drought, combined with what appears to have been social fragmentation and violence, made continued occupation impossible. Cahokia ended for reasons that are still not entirely clear, possibly including a combination of environmental degradation, social tension, and the kinds of political dynamics that beset any complex society over time. The Mississippian world was not destroyed by internal dynamics at all, but by the catastrophic external shock of European contact and the epidemic diseases that followed. What is remarkable about the pre-Columbian North American record is not that these civilizations collapsed. That is not remarkable at all. What is remarkable is that they existed at all, in the environments they did, with the resources they had, and that they sustained complex social organization, large-scale construction, long-distance exchange, and sophisticated ceremony and art for periods of time that in some cases rival or exceed those of the most celebrated civilizations of the Old World. Watson Break was occupied for more than 1,000 years, Poverty Point for 600 years, the Hopewell Network for 600 years, Chaco for 300 years. These are not short-lived experiments. These are durable achievements. They lasted because they worked, because they provided something that the communities participating in them needed and valued, because they were adapted, imperfectly but substantially, to the environments and the social conditions in which they existed. The collapses, when they came, were failures of adaptation to change conditions, not failures of the fundamental human capacity for complexity and organization that created these systems in the first place. And the people who lived through those collapses, who survived the drought or the epidemic or the political dissolution, carried forward their knowledge and their traditions and their social connections, and built new communities, new systems, new adaptations to the changed world they found themselves in. That is the deep story of pre-Columbian North America. Not the story of primitive people slowly progressing towards civilization, but the story of human beings, fully as capable and complex as any people who have ever lived, adapting and experimenting and achieving, and sometimes failing and adapting again, across thousands of years and dozens of cultural traditions, in one of the most diverse and challenging and beautiful environments on the planet. Let us carry that understanding with us as we move into the final part of tonight's exploration. Because there is more to tell, there are more mysteries to sit with, and there are questions that take us right up to the edge of what archaeology can currently answer, and then further still, into the realm of the genuinely unknown. Let us talk about the things we do not know. Let us talk about the gaps in the record. Let us talk about the sites that have not yet been found, the cultures that have not yet been named, the chapters of North American history that are still buried in the earth, waiting for the next LiDAR survey or the next careful excavation to reveal them. And let us talk about what those gaps might mean, and why the questions they leave open are worth sitting with, and why the mystery itself is not a failure of knowledge but a gift. Along the Atlantic coast of the eastern United States, from Florida to Maine, there are hundreds of archaeological sites that were once inhabited by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who encountered European explorers and colonists beginning in the late 15th century. Most of these sites have been imperfectly studied. Many have been partially or completely destroyed by development, and a significant proportion of them, those that once existed on or near the coast itself, have been lost entirely to sea level rise, erosion, and the encroachment of the ocean that has been ongoing since the end of the last ice age. When the last ice age ended, roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than they are today. The Atlantic coastline was more than 100 miles to the east of its current position in many places. A vast area of land that is now underwater was then above the surface, creating a broad coastal plain of river estuaries and lagoons and wetlands that would have been extraordinarily productive for human habitation. This drowned landscape was inhabited. We know this because fishing boats occasionally dredge up stone tools and other artifacts from the seafloor, artifacts that were clearly made by people and that date to periods when the seafloor was dry land. We know this because the genetics of some Native American populations show patterns consistent with coastal migration routes that are now underwater. We know this because the environmental conditions of the drowned coastal plain, with its abundant marine resources and relatively mild climate, would have been exactly the kinds of conditions that supported large and complex human populations elsewhere in the world. But we cannot excavate the seafloor easily. Underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and slow, and the sites that were once on the Atlantic coastal plain are now covered by anywhere from a few feet to hundreds of feet of water, scattered across an enormous area, often covered by additional layers of marine sediment. We will probably never know in detail what happened in the drowned coastal communities of pre-Columbian North America. This is a genuine loss, and it is worth pausing to appreciate it. We are talking about a potentially vast landscape of human habitation, extending from Florida to Maine and from the current coastline to well out onto the continental shelf, that was occupied by human beings for thousands of years and then drowned by rising seas, taking with it whatever architectural record, whatever earthwork tradition, whatever social complexity had developed there. The few artifacts that make it to the surface through the activities of fishing boats are tantalizing hints at a world we cannot recover. And this drowned landscape is just one example of the many ways in which the physical record of pre-Columbian North American life is incomplete. Organic materials rot. Wood, which was the primary building material for most North American cultures, survives in the archaeological record only under exceptional conditions of extreme dryness, as at Mesa Verde, or extreme wetness, as in waterlogged archaeological deposits. The great wooden structures of Cahokia, the longhouses of the eastern woodlands, the plank houses of the northwest coast, the post-framed buildings of the Hopewell ceremonial centers. All of these are known to us only through the holes their posts left in the ground, the occasional burned fragment preserved by charring, and the analogies we can draw from the few structures that survived in exceptional preservation conditions. Stone is more durable, but even stone monuments have been systematically destroyed across much of the eastern United States, where the mound-building tradition produced earthworks that were vulnerable to the plow and to the developer's bulldozer. The surveys that recorded mound sites before their destruction, conducted by archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, documented thousands of sites that are now gone, replaced by farmland or housing developments or industrial facilities. What was lost in those sites is irrecoverable, and there are the sites that we have never found at all, because even with all the surveys and all the excavations and all the LiDAR analysis of the last century, we are certainly still missing a large proportion of what once existed. Sites in forest that has never been surveyed by LiDAR. Sites in agricultural land where the plough has so thoroughly disturbed the surface that earthworks are no longer visible. Sites in river valleys where flood deposits have buried ancient occupation levels under feet of sediment. Sites in regions where archaeological survey has been sparse or non-existent. Sites whose surface expressions are so subtle, so degraded, so similar to natural topographic variation that they have not yet been recognized for what they are. The unknown is vast, and this has implications not just for our inventory of specific sites, but for our understanding of the broader patterns of pre-Columbian North American life. The picture we have is necessarily skewed by the distribution of research effort and the patterns of preservation. We know more about certain regions and certain periods than others, not necessarily because those regions and periods were more interesting or more complex, but because conditions were better for preservation and access was easier for researchers. One of the most profound implications of the incomplete record is that we may be systematically underestimating the density and complexity of pre-Columbian North American populations. There is now strong evidence that the pre-contact populations of the Americas, North and South, were much larger than the early estimates suggested. In the decades following European contact, epidemic diseases swept through the Americas in multiple waves, killing enormous proportions of the population in many regions before most of those regions had any direct contact with Europeans. The diseases traveled through native trade and communication networks far ahead of the colonists themselves. By the time English colonists arrived in New England in the early 17th century, they encountered a landscape that had already been devastated by epidemic disease. John Winthrop, one of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, described the land as a vast and empty wilderness, an assessment that conveniently overlooked the fact that it had been densely populated just years before, and that the apparent emptiness was the result of a catastrophic population collapse. The colonists interpreted the empty land as a gift from God, clearing the way for their settlement. What they were actually experiencing was the aftermath of one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Estimates of the pre-contact population of the Americas range from 20 million to more than 100 million people, with most recent scholarship converging on the upper end of that range for the Western Hemisphere as a whole. For North America specifically, estimates have risen in recent decades as researchers have grappled with the evidence for the severity and rapidity of the post-contact population collapse. A North American population of 5 to 10 million people before contact is no longer considered unreasonably high by most researchers, and some argue for even larger numbers. These population figures have implications for how we understand the landscape that Europeans encountered. A population of 5 to 10 million people living across the North American continent, concentrated in the most productive regions, would have produced a landscape that was far more thoroughly modified by human activity than the wilderness that European accounts describe. It would have been a landscape of managed forests, burned and tended to increase the productivity of useful plants and animals. A landscape of extensive agricultural fields, particularly in the temperate regions that could support maize horticulture. A landscape of settled communities and trail networks and resource management systems, all reflecting the accumulated knowledge and labor of thousands of years of continuous human habitation. That landscape is what existed before contact. The wilderness that Europeans described arriving in was not the pre-contact landscape. It was the post-epidemic landscape, a world in which a catastrophic population collapse had left fields untended, forests unburned, communities abandoned, and the visible signs of human management and development fading rapidly back into something that looked to European eyes like primeval nature, but was in fact the ruins of a complex and extensive human world. This realization, which has been building in the scholarly literature for several decades and is now fairly widely accepted among specialists, has profound implications for how we think about pre-Columbian North America. It means that the landscape Americans have celebrated as pristine wilderness, the forests of New England and the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, the prairies of the Midwest, even the great forests of the Pacific Northwest, are not pristine at all. They are recovery landscapes, vegetation that grew back after the human management systems that had maintained the previous landscape configuration were eliminated by population collapse. They are, in a sense, monuments to absence, to the people who once lived in them and shaped them and are now gone. This is a difficult thought to sit with. It requires a fundamental revision of the story Americans have told themselves about their relationship to the land. The narrative of settlers arriving in a wilderness and transforming it into productive civilization is not accurate. The more accurate story is that settlers arrived in the aftermath of a catastrophe, inherited a landscape that was in the process of reverting to wildness from a long period of human management, and then constructed a narrative that erased the previous human presence in order to justify their own. The monuments of pre-Columbian North America, the mounds and the earthworks and the great houses and the canal systems and the roads, are partly valuable precisely because they cannot be erased. They are too large, too durable, too unmistakably the product of human intention. They force the acknowledgement that people were here, that they did remarkable things here, that this land has a human history far longer and deeper and more complex than the American national story usually acknowledges. That acknowledgement is not just an academic exercise, it is a matter of historical justice. And it is, ultimately, a matter of understanding ourselves more clearly, of recognizing that the world we inhabit is not the beginning of a story, but a point somewhere in the middle of one that began long before us. Let us now spend some time with the most enduring and least answered question that the study of these lost megastructures raises. Not who built them, not how they were built, not even why they were built, but the deeper question of what it means that they were built. What does the existence of Monk's Mound and the Newark Octagon and Chaco Canyon and Poverty Point tell us about the nature of human civilization? What do these monuments, in their scale and their precision and their astronomical sophistication and their undeniable beauty, say about the people who made them and about us, their distant inheritors? They say, first and most fundamentally, that complexity is not the exclusive property of any single tradition or any single set of technological capabilities. The builders of the Newark Octagon did not need metal tools or literacy or wheeled vehicles to produce a monument of extraordinary astronomical precision. The builders of Cahokia did not need a formal state apparatus or a professional engineering corps to construct the largest earthen monument in the Western Hemisphere. The builders of Chaco did not need mortar or cranes or mechanical advantage beyond the simplest forms to produce masonry of genuine excellence. These achievements demonstrate that the human capacity for organized, purposeful, sophisticated action does not depend on the specific tools and institutions that Western civilization has conventionally associated with complexity. It depends on knowledge, on organization, on shared purpose, on the sustained commitment of communities to goals that extend beyond individual lifetimes and individual interests. This is a lesson that goes beyond the specific history of pre-Columbian North America. It is a lesson about human nature, about what human beings are capable of when they have a clear enough shared purpose and enough social organization to direct their efforts toward it. And it is a lesson that is particularly valuable at a moment in human history when we are confronting challenges, climate change and biodiversity loss, and the sustainable management of global resources that require exactly the kind of sustained, multi-generational, cooperative effort that built Monk's Mound and the Newark Octagon and Chaco Canyon. The people who built those monuments did not have the technology we have. They did not have our global communication systems or our scientific instruments or our engineering capabilities. But they had something that we need. They had the ability to maintain a shared commitment to a project across generations. To keep building a mound or maintaining a road or calibrating a solar observatory for centuries across the succession of individual lives, because the project was meaningful enough and the social structures were strong enough to sustain it. That capacity is not guaranteed to exist in any society. It has to be cultivated. It has to be maintained. It can be lost. And when it is lost, the projects that depended on it, the mounds and the observatories and the canal systems and the roads, begin to fall into disrepair. And eventually they are abandoned. And eventually they become ruins. And eventually they become mysteries. We are sitting with those mysteries tonight. And the most honest thing I can say about them is that we do not fully understand them. We have made enormous progress in the last century of research. We know vastly more about Cahokia and the Hopewell culture and Chaco and the Hohokam and the other civilizations we have been exploring tonight than we knew 100 years ago. We know more about their chronologies, their material culture, their exchange networks, their agricultural systems, their astronomical knowledge. We are better at asking questions about them, which means we are gradually getting better at answering them. But there is still so much we do not know. We do not know the political structures of Cahokia, who held power and how it was organized and transmitted. We do not know the ceremonial content of the Hopewell tradition, what the ceremonies in the great enclosures consisted of, what the dead were believed to experience after interment in their elaborate burial mounds. We do not know the language of the Hohokam or of Cahokia's builders. We do not know the specific astronomical observations that were recorded in the alignments of the Newark earthworks, beyond the broad pattern of lunar and solar tracking. We do not know who the individual people were who designed and oversaw these extraordinary projects, what their names were, what their lives were like, what they thought about what they were doing and why. We are working from monuments and artifacts and environmental data. We are working from the patient accumulation of physical evidence by generations of archaeologists. We are working, in some cases, from the oral traditions of indigenous peoples whose ancestors built or interacted with these monuments. But we are not working from written accounts, because the civilizations we are discussing did not write, or at least did not write in forms that have survived. The most direct testimony of the people who built these structures is absent, and that absence is part of what makes these monuments so moving. In the end, they are the work of people we cannot fully know, people who invested their lives and the lives of their communities in projects of enormous ambition and sophistication, people who tracked the moon for 19 years to encode its extreme position in the gateway of an earthwork, people who carried baskets of earth for generations to build a mound larger than the Great Pyramid, people who laid out a road system of hundreds of miles through the canyon country of the Southwest, for reasons that still perplex us. People who built their homes in cliff alcoves 150 feet above the canyon floor in a gesture of improbable beauty and pragmatic ingenuity. These people are our predecessors on this continent, not our ancestors in the biological sense, most of us, but our predecessors in the sense that they lived here first, that they shaped this landscape long before we arrived, that the world we inhabit is, in ways we are only beginning to understand, the legacy of their presence and their work. To know them, even incompletely, even through the indirect and fragmentary evidence of their monuments and their tools and their art, is to deepen our sense of what this continent is, what it has been, what it might be, and that deepening is worth every moment of careful attention we can give it. The monuments are still here. Monk's Mound still rises above the floodplain of the American bottom, visible from the interstate, waiting to be noticed. The Newark earthworks, what survives of them, still describe their extraordinary geometry across the Ohio countryside. The Great Serpent still coils along its ridge in Adams County. Chaco still commands its canyon in the New Mexico desert. Mesa Verde still holds its cliff dwellings in the sandstone alcoves of the Colorado Canyon country. Poverty Point still marks the Louisiana landscape with its concentric ridges and its great bird mound. They are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time, and they have things to tell us that we have not yet fully heard. So as we approach the end of this long night's exploration, let us give those monuments the attention they deserve. Let us sit with them for a moment, in our imagination, and try to feel what they are asking us to feel. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound at dawn. Look up at the slope of earth rising above you, 100 feet of carefully placed soil rising toward a sky that is turning from deep blue to the first pale light of morning. Somewhere up there, on a platform at the summit, there was once a building. A wooden building, perhaps large and elaborately decorated, where someone of great authority lived and conducted the ceremonies that organized the life of a city of 20,000 people. That person has been gone for 600 years. The building has been gone for nearly as long, but the mound is still there, still rising, still a monument to the ambition and the organizational capacity and the shared purpose of the people who built it. Now go to Newark. Stand in the center of the octagon and look toward the northeast, toward the gateway in the earthen wall that points to the rising of the moon at its northern extreme. The moon will not be at that extreme tonight. It was last there 9 years ago, and it will not return for another 9. But the gateway still points toward it. The alignment is still there, still encoded in the ancient earth, still carrying its record of the 19-year lunar cycle that Hopewell astronomers tracked and encoded into the geometry of this earthwork nearly 2,000 years ago. Now go to Chaco. Walk along the great road that comes in from the north, the straight track that approaches the canyon along a bearing as precise as a drawn line. Look at the walls of Pueblo Bonito rising above the canyon floor, their stone courses laid with the precision of someone who understood that beauty and durability were not separate goals but the same goal. Feel the wind that comes through the canyon and carries the heat of the desert and the cold of the Colorado Plateau in alternating currents. Now go to Mesa Verde. Climb the hand and toe holds in the cliff face and emerge into the alcove where Cliff Palace is built. Look at the stone towers rising above you, 4 stories of carefully fitted sandstone in a space that should not contain anything so ambitious. Look out from the ledge at the canyon that drops away below, at the forested mesa that rises above, at the horizon beyond which the world continues in every direction. These places are real, they are accessible, you can go to them. And if you do, and if you approach them with the patience and the humility and the willingness to be confused and astonished that they deserve, they will give you something that no book or documentary or podcast quite can. They will give you the direct experience of human achievement that is genuinely, productively, beyond your easy comprehension. They will make you feel, in a way that cannot be entirely articulated, the presence of minds that work differently from yours, that organized their world around different priorities, that invested their energy and their creativity and their social capital in projects whose meaning you can partially reconstruct but cannot fully inhabit. That experience of being genuinely in the presence of the genuinely unknown is one of the most valuable things the past has to offer. It is more valuable than the comfort of a tidy narrative. It is more valuable than the satisfaction of a complete explanation. It keeps the mind open. It keeps the imagination alive. It reminds us that the story of human life on this planet is far larger and stranger and more beautiful than any account of it can fully contain. America's lost megastructures are not lost because they were forgotten. They are lost in the sense that we have not yet fully found them. We are still in the process of discovering what they mean. We are still asking the questions they raise, and the answers we find, partial and provisional, as they always are, will continue to change our understanding of who we are and where we came from, and what human beings are capable of when they are at their most serious and most ambitious and most fully themselves. The mounds are still there. The roads are still there, in faint traces, in satellite images, in the alignment of modern irrigation canals over ancient tracks. The great houses are still there, roofless and windswept but still magnificent. still making the same claim on the landscape that they made when they were new. The earthworks are still there, inscribing their astronomical wisdom in the topography of the Ohio countryside, waiting for someone to stand at the right spot and look in the right direction and feel the connection between a point of light crossing the horizon and a gateway opening in an ancient wall of earth. These monuments have outlasted the societies that built them, outlasted the languages that named them, outlasted the ceremonies that animated them. They have outlasted everything except the earth itself and the sky above it, to which they were always addressed. And as long as we are willing to look, and to wonder, and to sit with the productive discomfort of not fully knowing, they will continue to teach us things that we need to know. The story of pre-Columbian North America is not over. It is, in the most important sense, still beginning. Every year, new excavations, new surveys, new analyses, new conversations between archaeologists and the indigenous communities whose ancestors built these monuments add to our understanding. Every year the picture becomes more detailed, more complex, more astonishing. Every year the gap between what our textbooks say happened in North America before Columbus and what actually happened grows a little narrower. That gap is still very wide. There is a great deal still to discover, a great deal still to understand. And that means that the story we have been telling tonight is not a final account. It is a progress report, a dispatch from the ongoing project of recovering the fullness of North American history. And it is a story that belongs to all of us, to the descendants of the people who built these monuments, who carry them in their ancestral memory and their living traditions, to the archaeologists and historians and scientists who are working to understand them, to the citizens of the United States who live in the shadow of these achievements, often without knowing it, and to you, wherever you are tonight, whatever brought you to this long and quiet exploration of the deep American past. You live in a world that is far older than you were taught, a world that was shaped by human hands and human minds and human purposes for thousands of years before the history you learned in school begins. A world whose monuments are still present in the landscape, still encoding the knowledge and the ambition and the spiritual life of people who are now known to us only through what they left in the ground. They left the mounds. They left the earthworks. They left the great houses and the canal systems and the roads. They left the copper plates and the effigy pipes and the marble statues. They left the hand stencils on the walls of rock shelters, pressed there by hands that are dust now but that once belonged to people who were fully alive, who felt the wind and tasted the river water and looked up at the same stars you are, somewhere, perhaps, looking up at tonight. They left all of this for us, though they did not know they were leaving it. They built it for their own purposes, for their own ceremonies and their own dead and their own communities and their own relationship to the cosmos. But it survives, it endures, and in enduring, it asks us to remember that we are not the beginning of this story. We are a chapter somewhere in its middle, and the chapters that came before us were remarkable and worth knowing. Rest now. Let the images settle. The mound still rises above the American bottom. The moon is still tracking its ancient course. The canyon is still there in the desert, its walls still bearing the work of hands that are centuries gone. And somewhere in the ground beneath your feet, wherever you are tonight in this vast and storied continent, there may be something waiting to be found. Something that will, when its time comes, add another chapter to the story we are still in the process of learning to read. Sleep well. The monuments are keeping watch. There is something about the stillness of these ancient places at night that the daytime visitor never quite experiences. When the tour groups have gone, and the visitor center is dark and the interpretive signs are invisible in the moonlight, the earthworks and the mounds and the great ruined buildings resume something of their original character. The silence returns. The sky asserts itself. And in that quiet, it becomes easier to understand, in a way that intellectual understanding alone cannot quite achieve, what it meant to build these places and to live among them. The people who inhabited Cahokia in its 11th century prime lived in a world organized around these mounds in ways that we can only partially reconstruct. The great platform mounds were not background scenery. They were the visible expression of a sacred geography, a way of organizing space that made certain locations more powerful than others, certain people more connected to cosmic forces than their neighbors. The chief who lived on the summit of Monk's Mound was not simply elevated in a physical sense. He was elevated in a cosmological sense, positioned closer to the sky world that was the source of power and legitimacy, further from the earth world in which ordinary people conducted their ordinary lives. This vertical cosmology, in which height corresponds to sacred power, is widespread in the cultures of pre-Columbian North America and reaches its most literal architectural expression in the platform mound tradition. By building their most important structures on elevated platforms, Mississippian and earlier woodland cultures were not simply making practical choices about visibility and defense. They were making a cosmological statement. They were encoding in the built environment their understanding of how the universe was organized and where power came from. The same vertical logic that organized the great mound complexes also organized the ceremonial life that took place within them. The ceremonies conducted on the summits of the platform mounds, whatever their specific form, were ceremonies that took place as close to the sky world as it was possible to get, while remaining on the surface of the earth. The participants in those ceremonies, whether as officiants or observers, were participating in an event that was cosmologically significant, that connected the human community to the powers of the sky and the powers of the earth in a way that the ceremony conducted on flat ground could not. We know very little about the specific content of Mississippian ceremonial life. The detailed oral traditions that would tell us what ceremonies were conducted and what they meant are lost, a casualty of the catastrophic disruption that European contact brought to the societies that had maintained them. What we have are the physical remains, the mounds and the plazas and the artifacts found in the burial contexts, and the broader context of southeastern ceremonial complex iconography that gives us some purchase on the symbolic vocabulary within which these ceremonies operated. That symbolic vocabulary, as we have noted, centers on a set of recurring images and themes that appear across an enormous geographic range and over several centuries of Mississippian and late woodland development. The birdman warrior, the cosmic falconer, the dancer with the wings and beak of a raptor combined with the body of a human being, is perhaps the most pervasive of these images, appearing on copper plates and shell gorgets and ceramic vessels from the northern reaches of Cahokia's influence to the Gulf Coast. This figure is clearly a being of power, a mediator between the human world and the bird world of the sky, a figure who can move between levels of the cosmos that ordinary humans cannot access. The chunky player, another recurring figure in the southeastern ceremonial complex iconography, represents a different dimension of Mississippian ceremonial life. Chunky was a game, a sport, in which players threw spears at a rolling stone disc and tried to predict where it would stop. The game was played on prepared chunky courts in Mississippian towns, and the imagery suggests that it had ceremonial significance as well as recreational function. The chunky player in the iconography is often depicted in ways that connect him to the cosmic birdman, suggesting that the game was not just entertainment but a ritual reenactment of some mythological event, or a ceremony that connected the human world to the cosmic powers represented by the birdman figure. Sports and games that carried ceremonial significance, that reenacted mythological events or petitioned cosmic powers, are well documented in many indigenous cultures of North America and Mesoamerica. The Mesoamerican ball game, which may have influenced the development of chunky and other North American ball games, was explicitly ceremonial in many contexts, connected to mythologies of cosmic conflict and renewal. And the widespread distribution of ball court architecture across the greater Southwest, extending from Mexico through Arizona and New Mexico, suggests that the ceremonial ballgame tradition spread northward along the same trade routes that carried turquoise and macaws and copper bells into the Chacoan world. The connections between the cultures of pre-Columbian North America and the civilizations of Mesoamerica, Mexico, and Central America are a topic that researchers have been debating for more than a century. The evidence for influence flowing northward from Mesoamerica is real but complex, and its interpretation remains contested. The maize plant itself, the corn that became the agricultural foundation of so many North American cultures, originated in Mesoamerica and spread northward through a process of domestication and trade and adaptation that unfolded over thousands of years. The ballgame, as we have noted, appears to have Mesoamerican origins. Certain architectural forms, including the platform mound with its flat top and its associated plaza, have analogies in Mesoamerican civic architecture, and some of the imagery of the southeastern ceremonial complex has been compared to Mesoamerican iconographic traditions, though the comparisons are often debated. But the influence did not flow only from south to north. The pre-Columbian world of the Americas was connected across enormous distances by trade routes and cultural contact that operated in multiple directions. Materials from the American Southwest found their way to Mesoamerica. Cultural traditions developed in the lower Mississippi Valley influenced communities to the north and east. The long-distance trade networks that moved copper and obsidian and shells and ideas across the continent were not one-way channels but complex webs of exchange in which influence could flow in any direction along any route. One of the most intriguing examples of this bidirectional connectivity is the distribution of cacao residue in ceramic vessels across the American Southwest. Cacao, the plant from which chocolate is made, was a luxury beverage in Mesoamerica, consumed by elites at ceremonies and feasts. Its cultivation was centered in the tropical lowlands of southern Mexico and Central America, and yet, ceramic vessels from Chacoan great houses in New Mexico have been found to contain residue of cacao-derived theobromine, clear chemical evidence that the people of Chaco were consuming a beverage made from cacao beans that had traveled more than 1,000 miles from their source. What does this tell us? It tells us that the people of Chaco were connected through a chain of exchange relationships that we can only partially reconstruct to the cacao-producing regions of Mesoamerica. It tells us that the luxury goods of one civilization were accessible, under the right conditions, to elites in communities thousands of miles away. It tells us that the Chacoan world was not isolated in the desert southwest, but was a node in a network of connections that extended far beyond the San Juan Basin, in multiple directions, across the full complexity of the pre-Columbian North American and Mesoamerican world. This is a picture of remarkable connectivity for a world without writing, or wheeled vehicles, or metal tools, or formal state structures. It is a picture that should force us to revise our assumptions about what was possible in the pre-Columbian world, and about how information and materials and ideas moved across the continent before Europeans arrived with their ships, and their horses and their diseases. The diseases are perhaps the most important thing in the story, and also the most tragic. They are important because they explain, more than any other single factor, why the pre-Columbian North American world is lost to us in the way that it is. They are tragic because the scale of the human catastrophe they produced is almost impossible to comprehend. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no prior exposure to the diseases that Europeans and Africans had been living with for centuries. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, typhoid, diphtheria, and a host of other epidemic diseases had shaped the genetic and immunological profile of Old World populations over long periods of time, selecting for resistance in those who survived and killing those who did not have it. The result was that Old World populations carried a degree of resistance to these diseases that indigenous American populations did not possess. When those diseases arrived in the Americas, beginning with Columbus's voyages in the 1490s, and accelerating rapidly in the 16th century, they met populations with no resistance at all. The result was mortality rates that modern epidemiologists find difficult to credit. In some regions, and for some diseases, mortality rates of 50, 70, or even 90% of the population within a few generations of first contact have been documented or inferred from the available evidence. The total human death toll across the Americas in the century following European contact may have been as high as 50 or 60 million people. This is the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. It is larger, in absolute numbers, and possibly in proportional terms, than the Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century. And it happened in a period so compressed and was so thoroughly followed by the displacement and cultural disruption of the survivors that the historical record of what existed before it is fragmentary and distorted in ways that we are still working to understand. The mounds and the earthworks and the great houses survived because they were built from materials that epidemic disease could not destroy. But the living communities that had built them, the oral traditions that explained their meaning, the ceremonial practices that animated them, the political structures that had organized their construction, all of these were devastated by the epidemic waves, and the survivors were left to make sense of what remained in a world that had been transformed beyond anything their predecessors had imagined. The resilience with which indigenous communities across North America responded to this catastrophe is itself one of the most remarkable stories in human history. They survived, they adapted, they maintained what they could of their cultural traditions, often in clandestine or hidden forms, against the active suppression of those traditions by colonial and later American government authorities. They carried forward what was essential, what was most deeply meaningful, through generations of dispossession and violence and cultural assault. And they are still here, still maintaining living connections to the world that built Cahokia and Chaco and Poverty Point and all the other sites we have been visiting tonight. The relationship between contemporary indigenous peoples and the archaeological study of their ancestors' sites is complex and sometimes contentious, and it is worth acknowledging that complexity here. The mound builder myth and the broader history of archaeology as a discipline that was practiced on native communities without their consent and often against their interests has left deep scars. The removal and display of human remains from burial mounds, which was standard practice in American archaeology for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, is a source of ongoing and justified grievance. The interpretation of sites by non-indigenous scholars working from outside the cultural traditions those sites embody is inherently limited in ways that those scholars are not always adequately aware of. The best work in contemporary North American archaeology is work that is done in genuine collaboration with indigenous communities, that takes oral traditions seriously as historical evidence, that involves native scholars and community members in the research process, and that works to return to those communities some measure of the knowledge and the authority over their own history that the colonial process took from them. This work is not always easy, and it does not always resolve the tensions that exist between archaeological methods and indigenous epistemologies, but it is producing better, more complete, more honestly contextualized knowledge of pre-Columbian North America than the field could produce when it was working in isolation from the communities whose history it was studying. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is now managed with the involvement of tribes who have identified it as an important ancestral site. The earthworks at Newark are the subject of ongoing consultation with tribal nations who maintain connections to the Hopewell tradition. Chaco Canyon is managed by the National Park Service in collaboration with the Pueblo nations, who regard it as an ancestral site, and their perspective increasingly shapes how the site is interpreted and presented to the public. These are imperfect but real steps toward a more honest and more collaborative approach to the study and preservation of North America's ancient heritage. The monuments deserve this care. They have endured long enough to deserve it, and the communities whose ancestors built them deserve to be active participants in how those ancestors' achievements are understood and honored. As this long night of exploration approaches its end, I want to return to something simpler, to the experience of standing before one of these ancient places and simply paying attention, because in the end, all the archaeology and all the astronomical analysis and all the debates about population estimates and trade networks and political organization, all of it is in service of something very simple. The attempt to be present with the human beings who made these things and to understand, as fully as we can across the gulf of centuries, what they were doing and why. That attempt is never fully successful. There is always a gap. There is always something that the evidence cannot tell us, that the oral traditions do not specify, that the iconography hints at but cannot quite communicate across the cultural distance between their world and ours. That gap is not a failure. It is a condition of the undertaking, and learning to sit with that gap, to be comfortable with not fully knowing, to find the productive space between what we know and what we do not know, is one of the most important skills that the study of the ancient world cultivates. The people who built Monk's Mound were trying to do something. They had a purpose. They had a vision of what they were creating and why it mattered. That vision was not simply the accumulation of 22 million cubic feet of earth in a particular configuration. It was something larger, something that connected the built form to the social world and the ceremonial world and the cosmological world in ways that made the accumulation of all that earth feel not merely worthwhile but necessary. We can partially understand that purpose. We can partially recover the vision. We can say, with confidence, that the people of Cahokia were building a sacred geography, an organized landscape in which certain elevated places were closer to the sky world and its powers, in which a central plaza provided the communal space for the ceremonies that held the city together, in which the positioning of the mounds relative to each other and to the cardinal directions encoded a cosmological order that gave shape and meaning to the human world within it. But we cannot fully inhabit that vision. We cannot feel it from the inside, in the way that the person carrying a basket of earth up the growing slope of Monk's Mound could feel it, knowing that the work they were doing was part of something sacred and important and connected to the deepest structures of the universe as they understood it. That irreducible distance between us and them is not a reason for discouragement. It is a reason for continued curiosity. It is a reminder that there is always more to learn, always more to understand, always more to be moved by in the record of human achievement that the earth preserves. And so, as you drift toward sleep, carry this with you. This continent has a history that goes back thousands and thousands of years. A history of extraordinary achievement and genuine sophistication, of astronomical knowledge and artistic mastery, and organizational capacity on a continental scale. A history that belongs to all of us who live on this land, whether we are the descendants of the people who built these monuments or the descendants of people who came here later. A history that is still being recovered, still being understood, still being translated from the language of the earth into the language of human comprehension. The monuments are patient. They have been waiting for this for a very long time, and they will wait a while longer, while we continue the slow and beautiful work of learning to read them. There is a canyon in New Mexico where the wind has been blowing since before any human being set foot on this continent. The walls of that canyon, layered in their bands of sandstone and their accumulated centuries of weathering, have seen things that no written record preserves. They saw the first human beings arrive in the region, sometime in the deep past, and make their first tentative camps in the shelter of the canyon walls. They saw the slow accumulation of knowledge and skill and social organization that eventually produced the great houses of Chaco, with their precise stonework and their astronomical alignments, and their roads spreading outward in every direction like the roots of a great tree. They saw the peak of Chacoan power, the processions and the ceremonies and the redistribution of goods, and the construction crews laboring with their stone tools and their wooden levers and their endless baskets of rubble. They saw the drought come, and the people leave, and the buildings stand empty in the wind. They saw the centuries pass. They are still there. They will be there after us, those canyon walls. Whatever we make of the world in our time, whatever we build and whatever we fail to build, and whatever we understand and whatever we fail to understand, the canyon will remain. The wind will continue. The sandstone will continue its slow dissolution, grain by grain, into the sediment that will, in geological time, become new rock, and the cycle will continue. The people who built in that canyon understood something about that cycle. They were not building for permanence in the sense that they expected their buildings to last forever. They knew that buildings decay, that roofs fall in, that walls crumble. They built with care and with skill, but they did not build from a delusion of permanence. They built because building was the appropriate expression of the community's capacity and intention at that moment in its life. And then they maintained what they built, and when maintenance became impossible, they moved on, and the buildings were left to the wind. That is a different relationship to construction than the one we typically maintain. We tend to build with the expectation that our structures will be permanent, or at least that we will be long gone before they fail. The people of Chaco built with a different understanding, an understanding of the impermanence of human structures within the permanence of the natural world, an understanding that the act of building matters more than the survival of what was built. Maybe that is part of what the monuments are trying to tell us. Not that we should aspire to build things that last forever, but that we should aspire to build things that are worth building. Things that express something true about our community's understanding of the world and our place in it. Things that are oriented toward the cosmos and toward each other, toward beauty and toward meaning, toward the natural world that surrounds us and the human community that sustains us. The mound builders of the pre-Columbian North American world built things that were worth building. They built them with knowledge and care and sustained effort and shared purpose. And 1,000 years later, their monuments still stand in the landscape, still asking to be understood, still offering the incomparable gift of genuine mystery to anyone willing to approach them with patience and humility and an open mind. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, in the end, what civilization is. Not the accumulation of technologies or the expansion of empires or the growth of cities or the development of writing and coinage and formal law. Those are instruments, some of them useful and some of them harmful and most of them mixed. Civilization, at its core, is the decision to invest in something larger than the individual, to build something that will outlast you, to participate in a project that extends across generations and that expresses something about what human beings are for and what the world is like and how the two should relate to each other. The people who built Monk's Mound made that decision. The people who built the Newark Octagon made that decision. The people who dug the Hohokam canals made that decision. The people who carried 200,000 timbers to Chaco Canyon made that decision. The people who pressed their hands against cliff walls and blew pigment around them to leave their mark made that decision. We are the inheritors of all those decisions. We live in the long shadow of all that building, whether we know it or not, and the monuments are still here, still asking us to know it, still inviting us into a relationship with the deep past of this continent that can change how we understand ourselves and the world we are in the process of making. Sleep now. The night is long and the mounds are patient. Tomorrow the sun will rise and the canyon walls will glow in the early light. And somewhere a road that has not been walked in 600 years will lie faint in the desert, marked only by a slightly different color of soil and a subtly different texture of stone, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for someone with the right eyes to see it. We are learning to see, slowly, imperfectly, with all the limitations that attend any human project of understanding, but we are learning, and that matters. More than we can easily say, it matters. Good night. The monuments are keeping watch. There is a chapter in this story that we have not yet told, and it belongs to the far north, to the people who lived at the edge of what was habitable, in the subarctic and Arctic regions of North America, and who developed, over thousands of years, technologies and adaptations that were as sophisticated in their own way as anything we have encountered at the mound complexes of the Ohio Valley or the great houses of the Southwest. The ancestors of the Inuit and related Arctic peoples spread across North America from Alaska to Greenland over a period of roughly 5,000 years, beginning around 2,500 BCE with the Arctic small tool tradition and developing through a succession of cultural phases until the emergence of the tool culture around 1000 CE, whose expansion eastward brought the ancestors of the historic Inuit to every part of the Arctic coast, from Alaska to Labrador and Greenland. What these people achieved in one of the most demanding environments on Earth deserves the same awe and careful attention that we bring to the platform mounds of the Mississippi Valley or the astronomical earthworks of Ohio. Because building a life in the Arctic, sustaining communities across the long winter darkness and the summer ice melt and the frozen seas, required knowledge and ingenuity and social organization of a very high order. The technology of Arctic survival was, in many ways, as sophisticated as anything produced by the mound-building civilizations of the temperate East. The design of the kayak, that extraordinary single-person hunting vessel made from driftwood frames and animal skin, represents a pinnacle of engineering adapted to a very specific set of conditions, light enough to be carried, stable enough to be righted when capsized, fast enough to pursue prey, and built from materials available in an environment with almost no trees and no metal. The umiaks, larger skin boats capable of carrying entire families and their possessions, were equally remarkable achievements of design and construction. The harpoon systems used for hunting marine mammals, with their detachable heads and their float mechanisms to prevent the wounded animal from sinking, were ingenious solutions to the problem of hunting animals in water. The design of the igloo, the dome-shaped snow house that can be constructed in a few hours and that maintains a temperature above freezing inside even when the outside temperature is 60 below, is an architectural achievement of remarkable efficiency. But the technology was only part of the story. The knowledge required to survive in the Arctic, the ecological understanding of ice conditions and animal behavior and weather patterns, and navigation in a featureless landscape of snow and sea, was comprehensive and precise, and accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and systematic transmission from generation to generation. This knowledge is embedded in the oral traditions of Arctic peoples and in the practices of those traditions, and it represents one of the most extraordinary bodies of practical environmental knowledge ever developed by human communities anywhere in the world. The Arctic peoples also created art. Ivory carvings from Dorset culture sites dating to roughly 500 BCE to 1000 CE are among the most hauntingly beautiful objects in the pre-Columbian North American record. Tiny human figures and animal forms carved from walrus, ivory, and bone, with extraordinary precision and expressiveness. Objects whose scale is intimate, but whose artistic power is immediate and undeniable. Dorset shamanic imagery, masks and figurines representing the supernatural beings whose goodwill was essential for successful hunting, reflects a spiritual world of great complexity and visual sophistication. The Thule people, whose westward origins and rapid spread across the North American Arctic after about 1000 CE, are one of the most remarkable population movements in pre-Columbian North American history, left behind their own material record of a culture adapted to conditions that would defeat any society without precisely the right knowledge and the right technology. Their house sites, semi-subterranean dwellings built from whalebone frameworks and covered with sod and skin, survive in the archaeological record as distinctive arrangements of large bone and stone that have been studied by archaeologists across the entire breadth of the Arctic coast. The Thule expansion appears to have been driven in part by the development of the toggling harpoon and the large umiak capable of hunting the bowhead whale, the largest animal in the Arctic ecosystem, and a source of meat and oil and bone sufficient to sustain large communities through the winter darkness. Communities that could reliably hunt bowhead whales had access to a resource so abundant that it transformed the possibilities of Arctic life, supporting larger populations and more substantial settlements than had been possible with the hunting strategies of earlier Arctic cultures. The story of Arctic cultures is a story about human adaptability at its most extreme. It is a story about what happens when a species adapted to tropical conditions by its evolutionary history encounters one of the most demanding environments on the planet and persists there, year after year, generation after generation, not by changing its biology, but by developing knowledge and technology and social systems capable of sustaining human life where almost nothing else can live. That is an achievement of the same fundamental order as building Monk's Mound or laying out the Newark Octagon. It is the achievement of a community investing its collective intelligence and its accumulated knowledge in the project of survival and flourishing in conditions that are almost hostile to both. Now let us return, one more time, to the question of what all of this means. Not in the narrow sense of historical interpretation, but in the broader sense of what it says about our situation as human beings living in the early 21st century, inhabiting a planet whose limits we are beginning to encounter in ways that have no precedent in recorded history. The pre-Columbian civilizations of North America faced limits. They faced the limits of their environments, of their agricultural systems, of their social organizations, of their water supplies in the desert, of their food systems in the subarctic. They faced those limits with the knowledge and the technology and the social structures available to them. Sometimes they found ways through, sometimes they did not. Sometimes they collapsed, and the people who survived found new adaptations, new ways of organizing their lives in the changed conditions that followed collapse. That pattern is not comforting in a simple way. It does not offer the reassurance of an inevitable happy ending, but it does offer something. It offers the evidence that human beings are capable of adapting to radically changed conditions, that communities can reorganize themselves in response to new constraints, that knowledge and social organization can be redirected toward new challenges. That collapse is not the end but a transition, painful and disruptive but not final. The descendants of the people who built Cahokia and Chaco and Poverty Point are still here. They adapted to the collapse of the systems their ancestors had built. They found new ways to live, new social organizations, new relationships to the landscape. They maintained the knowledge and the traditions that were most essential, and they let go, because they had to, of what could not be sustained in the changed world they found themselves in. That capacity for adaptation, for letting go of what cannot be sustained while holding on to what is essential, is perhaps the most important lesson that the pre-Columbian North American world has to offer us. We live in a moment when we too are being asked to let go of things that cannot be sustained. Systems of resource use that are depleting the foundations of the world's productivity. Social organizations that are generating inequality and conflict on a scale that threatens their own stability. Relationships to the natural world that are disrupting the climatic and ecological systems on which human life depends. The ancient mound builders and the desert irrigators and the cliff dwellers and the Arctic hunters did not know how to solve our specific problems. But they knew something more fundamental. They knew that human beings can organize themselves for very different purposes than the ones we are currently organized for. That what seems like the fixed and inevitable shape of the world is actually a configuration, chosen and maintained through collective decision and collective effort, that can be reconfigured when the conditions that produced it change. That the monuments of one era are not the final word on what human beings can build, but only the evidence of what human beings chose to build at that particular moment in their history. We are at a moment when new choices are required, and looking at the full sweep of pre-Columbian North American history, with its extraordinary diversity of responses to the challenges of living in this continent's many environments, is one of the most useful ways I know to cultivate the imagination required for those choices. To see that human beings have done things very differently from how we do them now. To see that communities have organized themselves around purposes very different from the ones we currently organize ourselves around. To see that the relationship between human communities and their environments has taken forms very different from our current one, and has sometimes been more sustainable and sometimes less. And that the difference lay not in some mystical quality of pre-industrial life, but in the specific choices about knowledge, organization, and values that shaped each particular civilization. The great earthworks of North America are invitations to that imagination. They ask us to think differently about scale, about time, about purpose, about what it means to invest in something that will outlast you, about what it means to build toward the sky, not to conquer the sky but to acknowledge it, to orient your community's life toward the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars in a way that connects the human world to the larger rhythms of the cosmos. We have largely lost that orientation. Our cities do not align with the solstices. Our buildings do not encode the lunar calendar in their gateways. Our roads do not run straight and true toward the ceremonies that give our communities meaning. We have other ways of understanding our place in the cosmos, ways that are in some respects far more powerful and precise than those available to the people of Cahokia or Chaco. But we have also lost something in the transition, a sense of direct, embodied connection to the rhythms of the natural world that the ancient monuments, in their careful orientation to the sky, both embodied and preserved. You do not have to build a mound to recover that connection, but you can visit the mounds, You can stand in the center of the Woodhenge Circle at Cahokia and watch the sun rise on the equinox through the gap in the reconstructed posts. You can walk the path of the Newark Octagon and feel the gateway aligning with the lunar standstill. You can stand in the canyon at Chaco at noon on the winter solstice and watch the light find the center of the spiral on the cliff face above you. These experiences are available. They are not expensive. They are not exclusive. They are there, in the landscape of this country, waiting for anyone willing to seek them out. And they will do something to you if you let them. They will make the pre-Columbian North American world feel less like history and more like presence. Less like something that happened to other people in a distant time, and more like a layer of the same world you are living in, just beneath the surface of the contemporary, still shaping the landscape and the ecology and the cultural memory of the country you inhabit. That is the gift these monuments offer. Not just knowledge, not just the facts of who built them and when and how large, but presence. The felt experience of being in the same world that they were in, looking at the same sky, standing on the same ground, part of the same long story that began long before any of us were born and will continue long after we are gone. The mounds are still there. The great houses are still there. The earthworks, those that survive, are still there. The canyon still holds its road alignments in the faint pattern of soil that LiDAR reveals. The old copper mines still mark the Keweenaw Peninsula with their vast waste piles and their water-filled pits. The serpent still coils along its ridge in southern Ohio. The great bird of Poverty Point still spreads its wings above the Louisiana floodplain. They are there. They are real. And they belong to the history of this continent and to all of us who live on it, whether we know it or not. The question is only whether we will take the time to know it. Whether we will extend to the builders of these extraordinary places the attention and the respect and the honest curiosity they deserve. Whether we will allow the story of pre-Columbian North America to become part of our own story, part of how we understand the land we live on and the people who shaped it before us. I believe we will. Slowly, imperfectly, as we do everything. But the trajectory is clear. The scholarship is deepening. The public attention is growing. The collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous communities is producing better knowledge than either could produce alone. The LiDAR surveys are revealing what was hidden. The ancient DNA analysis is illuminating the migrations and the relationships that conventional archaeology could only guess at. And the monuments themselves, patient as they have always been, are still there, still present, still waiting to be more fully known. That work will not be finished in our lifetimes. The pre-Columbian North American world is too large, too complex, too thoroughly disrupted by the events of the last 500 years to be fully recovered and fully understood in any single generation's work. But each generation can add something, can know a little more, understand a little better, appreciate a little more fully the extraordinary human achievement that was pre-Columbian North America. And that is worth doing. It is worth the careful excavation and the patient analysis and the long hours of reading and the long miles of traveling to sites that most people have never heard of. It is worth the intellectual humility required to sit with what we do not know. It is worth the emotional challenge of confronting a history that is, in some of its dimensions, deeply troubling. The history of how these civilizations were destroyed, and their remains were misrepresented and their descendants were dispossessed. It is worth all of this because these were human beings, fully human, fully capable, fully alive in the world in ways that we can partially understand and must deeply respect. They built things that endure. They knew things that we have lost and are slowly recovering. They organized their communities and their ceremonies and their knowledge and their art around purposes that we can partially comprehend and that might, if we allow them to, inspire us to think differently about our own purposes. They are gone, most of them, in the sense that the specific social worlds they inhabited are gone, dissolved by time and epidemic and colonization and all the other forces that unmake human worlds. But they are also here, in the earth beneath our feet, in the sky above our heads, in the monuments that their labor produced and that the passage of centuries has not been able to erase. And on a night like this one, When the world is quiet and the mind is drifting towards sleep, it is possible to feel them, not as ghosts, not as supernatural presences, but as the weight of human time, accumulated in the landscape, expressed in the patient geometry of earthen mounds and canyon roads, and ancient canal alignments, and cliff face hands pressed in ochre against stone. They were here. They built things worth building. They knew things worth knowing. And we are the inheritors of a world they shaped, whether we acknowledge that inheritance or not. Better to acknowledge it. Better to know the names of the places where they built their monuments, to understand something of what those monuments meant, to carry in our minds the sense of a human history on this continent that goes back thousands and thousands of years and is still present in the landscape around us. Monk's Mound, the Newark Octagon, the Great Serpent, Chaco Canyon, Cliff Palace, Poverty Point, Watson Break, the Hohokam Canals beneath Phoenix, the copper mines of the Keweenaw, Etowah, and all the hundreds and thousands of other sites, large and small, known and unknown, surviving and destroyed, that constitute the full record of pre-Columbian achievement in North America. Remember them. Visit them if you can. Honor them as the monuments of a civilization we are still learning to understand, and carry with you the knowledge that the land you live on is not empty of history. It is full of it, deeper and stranger and more beautiful than the story you were told in school, and still, in every meaningful sense, alive. Sleep well. The past is all around you, and it has been waiting a very long time to be known. There is one final thought worth carrying into sleep tonight, one last image to settle with, before the mind releases its hold on the waking world and the ancient places recede into the deeper country of dreams. Somewhere in the American heartland, in the soft hours before dawn, a mound stands against a sky that is beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly at the horizon. The mound has been standing there for 1,000 years. The air around it is still and cool, and in the growing pale of early morning, the shape of the mound against the sky is the shape that it has always been. The long curve of compacted earth that 10,000 people built with their hands and their baskets and their shared purpose, in a time when this continent held a world that most of us have never been taught to imagine. That mound is still there. It will still be there tomorrow. And with every morning that it stands, it is one more morning of invitation. One more morning when anyone who cares to look can look and see and wonder and begin, perhaps, to understand. That is enough. That is more than enough. Good night. And if this journey through the lost world of pre-Columbian North America has given you something tonight, some image to carry forward, some question to sit with, some new sense of the depth of this continent's human history, then the ancient builders have done what monuments have always done in the end. They have reached across the centuries and touched someone who needed touching. They have done what all the greatest human works do when they endure long enough to find the right moment and the right witness. They have made the past feel present, and the present feel just a little more ancient and more full of meaning than it did before. The mounds are patient. The canyon walls remember everything. Sleep well and dream of what endures. In every sunrise over the American bottom, in every winter solstice that arrives and passes over the canyon country of New Mexico, in every spring flood that rises against the old earthworks of Louisiana and recedes again to leave them standing as they have always stood, the ancient world of pre-Columbian North America reasserts its quiet and enduring presence. It asks nothing dramatic of us, only attention, only the willingness to know what happened here, and to carry that knowing forward into whatever comes next. That is the work, that is the whole of it, and it is enough. North America reasserts its quiet and enduring presence. It asks nothing dramatic of us, only attention, only the willingness to know what happened here, and to carry that knowing forward into whatever comes next. That is the work, that is the whole of it, and it is enough.